in the deep green heart of Southeast Asia, where time seems to flow with the gentle rhythm of ancient rivers, stone sentinels stand watch over forgotten centuries. As twilight descends across the Cambodian landscape, the massive temples of a once mighty civilization emerge from mist and memory. Towers of sandstone rising like fossilized dreams against the darkening sky. These are the whispers of the Khmer Empire, echoes of glory preserved in stone and shadow. The morning light touches these ancient structures differently than it touches our modern world. It filters through the canopy of dipterocarp trees and strangler figs, casting dappled patterns across weathered carvings of celestial dancers and divine beings. The stones breathe with the morning dew, exhaling the collected warmth of 1,000 years. If you were to place your palm against these walls now, you might feel the heartbeat of history itself, steady, unhurried, enduring. Tonight, as you rest, we will journey together through the rises and falls, the triumphs and transformations of one of humanity's most remarkable civilizations. From humble beginnings in the fertile floodplains to the creation of the largest religious monument on Earth, from ingenious water systems that nurtured millions to the quiet forest reclamation of abandoned temples, the story of the Khmer Empire offers us perspective, wonder, and perhaps most valuably, a gentle reminder of the impermanence that touches all human endeavors. Let the soft cadence of this ancient tale carry you toward peaceful dreams as we begin our journey in a land of legends. Long before the rise of the great temple mountains, before the divine kings proclaimed their celestial authority, the land that would become the Khmer Empire was already ancient. The waters of the Mekong River and its tributaries had been shaping the landscape for millennia, depositing rich silt across floodplains that would nurture countless generations. In these fertile lowlands, early communities formed bonds with the rhythm of the seasons, with the ebb and flow of waters that would later become central to Khmer prosperity. The earliest written accounts speak of a kingdom called Phnom, thought to have emerged around the 1st century CE in the Mekong Delta of present-day Cambodia and southern Vietnam. Chinese chronicles describe this civilization as a sophisticated maritime state with a system of canals for transportation and irrigation that foreshadowed later Khmer achievements. The people of Phnom were seafarers and traders, connecting the maritime routes between China and India, absorbing influences from both great civilizations. Their settlements dotted the coastlines and riverways, places where the gentle lapping of water against wooden piers marked the passage of days. Legend tells us that Phnom began with an extraordinary encounter. A foreign prince named Count Dinya had a dream in which he was gifted a divine bow. Following this vision, he sailed to the shores of Southeast Asia, where he encountered a local princess named Soma, daughter of the Naga king, the mythical serpent deity associated with water and fertility. As Soma approached in her boat, Kaundinya shot an arrow from his magical bow, causing the princess to surrender her land to him. Their marriage united foreign and indigenous bloodlines, creating a dynasty that would rule for generations. This founding myth reflects the actual blending of Indian cultural and religious concepts with indigenous traditions that characterized early Southeast Asian states. Sanskrit inscriptions began to appear alongside local languages. Hindu deities found homes in temples built according to Indian principles, but adapted to local materials and aesthetics. The slow, organic integration of these traditions created something entirely new, not simply imported Indian culture, but a uniquely Southeast Asian expression of shared cosmic understanding. By the 6th century, the kingdom of Phnom had declined, perhaps due to changing trade routes or internal pressures. From its foundations emerged several successor states collectively known as Chenla, which controlled much of what is now Cambodia, Laos, and eastern Thailand. These kingdoms were less maritime-focused than Phnom, turning their attention instead to the rich agricultural potential of the inland plains and valleys. Chenla was not a unified state, but rather a collection of principalities ruled by local elites who competed and sometimes cooperated with one another. They built modest temples of brick and laterite, established trading networks with China, and continued the process of cultural synthesis begun in the Funan period. The gentle sound of prayer bells would have mingled with the calls of waterbirds and the rustle of rice stalks in the breeze, a soundscape of settled agricultural life that would characterize the region for centuries to come. Life in these pre-Khmer societies followed the natural cycles of the monsoon, the annual rhythm of planting with the spring rains, and harvesting in the drier winter months created a predictable pattern around which community and religious life was organized. Local spirits of the soil and water, the Nikta, were honored alongside Hindu deities. Village shamans communicated with ancestral spirits, while Brahmin priests conducted Sanskrit rituals for the elite. This layering of belief systems created a spiritual landscape as rich and complex as the physical environment. In the soft glow of evening cooking fires, elders would have shared stories connecting their communities to cosmic origins. Children would have listened, wide-eyed, to tales of gods who churned the primordial ocean and of ancestors who cleared the first fields from jungle. These stories formed an unbroken thread connecting each generation to the next, weaving together worldly and divine realms into a single tapestry of understanding. Much like today, the quiet moments of storytelling provided both entertainment and instruction, shaping young minds with the values and knowledge needed to continue their cultural traditions. As the 8th century drew to a close, these scattered Chenla principalities were poised for transformation. The stage was set for the emergence of a leader who would unite the competing polities into something greater, a true empire with centralized authority and a divine mandate. The foundations had been laid in the agricultural prosperity, the religious syncretism, and the architectural knowledge developed over centuries. All that was needed was the catalyst, a leader with the vision and capability to harness these elements into a new political formation that would dominate Southeast Asia for the next 600 years. The transition would not be sudden or dramatic, but rather a gradual coalescence of power, like the slow gathering of monsoon clouds before the life-giving rains. And so we turn now to the figure who would become the first true emperor of the Khmer people, a leader whose actions would set in motion a civilization whose temples would one day inspire wonder throughout the world. The year was 802 CE. In a ceremony atop the sacred mountain of Phnom Kulen, a prince named Jayavarman II performed a ritual that would forever alter the course of Southeast Asian history. Surrounded by Brahmin priests and local nobility, he declared himself Chakravartin, a universal monarch independent from any foreign power. The mountain, rising gently above the northern plains near present-day Siem Reap, offered a commanding view of the lands that would form the heart of his new kingdom. Early morning mist would have clung to the valleys below, parting occasionally to reveal glimpses of the vast territory that would soon be united under a single authority. Jayavarman's declaration of independence was specifically targeted at freeing the Khmer lands from the influence of Java, which historians believe referred either to the Javanese Sailendra dynasty or perhaps another Southeast Asian power. The details have faded with time, but the significance remains clear. This was a moment of self-determination, of a people claiming their own destiny through the assertion of a new political and religious order. The ceremony that established Jayavarman II's authority was more than political, it was profoundly spiritual. Working with his priest Sivakaivalya, he established the cult of the Devaraja, often translated as God King. This complex religious innovation positioned the Khmer monarch as a special intermediary between the earthly and divine realms. While scholars continue to debate the exact nature of this cult, inscriptions suggest it involved the worship of a royal linga, a sacred phallic symbol representing the Hindu god Shiva associated with each king, and housed in a temple mountain that would serve as the kingdom's ritual center. The soft golden light of oil lamps would have illuminated the sacred space where this first Devaraja ritual took place. The fragrance of incense, sandalwood perhaps, or locally harvested aromatic resins would have mingled with the natural scents of the mountain forest. The rhythmic chanting of Sanskrit mantras by Brahmin priests created an oral bridge between human and divine worlds. These sensory elements combined to create a moment of transcendent power, establishing a pattern of royal legitimation that would continue for centuries. Jayavarman II did not build his empire through conquest alone, though military power certainly played a role. Instead, he employed a combination of strategic marriages, diplomatic alliances, and religious authority to bring together previously independent chieftains under his overarching rule. This process unfolded gradually, with the new emperor travelling to different regions, establishing temporary capitals, and absorbing local power structures into his expanding network of authority. His first capital was established at Hariharalaya, near present-day Rolluos. Here, in a landscape of gentle undulations broken by occasional sandstone outcroppings, the foundations of Khmer imperial architecture began to take shape. Early temples built of brick, laterite and sandstone emerged from the floodplain modest precursors to the magnificent structures that would follow in later centuries. These temples housed the sacred lingas that represented divine kingship, their inner sanctuaries cool and dark even in the heat of midday, places where the boundary between human and divine seemed to dissolve in the fragrant darkness. The everyday experience of people living during this formative period would have varied greatly depending on their position in society. For the majority farmers tending rice fields in village communities, the emergence of the Khmer Empire might initially have meant little more than a shift in where their surplus production was directed. Perhaps new officials appeared periodically to collect taxes, or young men were occasionally called away for labour service on construction projects or military campaigns. The rhythm of agricultural life continued much as before, governed by the monsoon and the requirements of rice cultivation. For those closer to the centres of power, priests, officials, artisans and warriors. The consolidation of authority under Jayavarman II created new opportunities and challenges. The establishment of a more centralised administration required literate bureaucrats to manage royal affairs. Temples needed craftspeople skilled in stonework, wood carving, and metalwork. The expanding court created demand for dancers, musicians, and other artistic specialists. A new social complexity emerged alongside the political unification, creating the foundations for the cultural flowering that would characterize the Khmer Empire at its height. Jayavarman II ruled for nearly 30 years, until approximately 8035 CE. His successors, Jayavarman III and Indravarman III, continued the work of consolidation and expansion. Under Indravarman, the first major Baray reservoir was constructed at Hariharalaya, the Indratataka, foreshadowing the sophisticated water management systems that would become a hallmark of Khmer civilization. This vast artificial lake, covering nearly 1 square kilometre, reflected the increasing organisational capacity of the young empire and its growing understanding of how to harness the seasonal waters for agriculture and symbolic power. As twilight settled over the Cambodian plains at the close of the 9th century, the Khmer Empire was still in its nascent form. The great temples of Angkor had not yet risen. The vast irrigation networks were just beginning to take shape. The full expression of Khmer artistic genius remained unrealized. Yet the essential foundations had been established. A divine monarchy supported by Hindu cosmology, a centralized administration capable of mobilizing significant resources, and the beginnings of the architectural and engineering traditions that would produce wonders. Like a lotus bud floating on the dark waters of a beret, the Khmer civilization was poised to unfold its petals in magnificent display. The groundwork laid by Jayavarman II would support centuries of cultural, architectural, and political development. His innovation of divine kingship would provide ideological justification for the massive building projects to come. His unification of previously scattered polities created the political stability necessary for long-term cultural evolution. As night deepens and stars appear above the ancient landscape, we can imagine how those same celestial lights watched over the birth of an empire that would leave an indelible mark on human history. The story was just beginning, its grandest chapters yet to be written in stone and water across the face of the land. In the heart of the Cambodian basin, where the great lake of Tonle Sap expands and contracts with the rhythm of the seasons, the Khmer engineers discovered the secret to building an empire: the masterful manipulation of water. This was no ordinary lake, but rather an extraordinary natural phenomenon that would become the lifeblood of Khmer civilization. During the dry season, Tonle Sap covers roughly 2,500 square kilometers, a vast mirror reflecting the cloud-scattered sky. But when the summer monsoon swells the Mekong River, something remarkable occurs. The Tonle Sap River, which normally drains the lake into the Mekong, reverses its flow entirely. Water pushes back upstream, causing the lake to expand to 5 times its dry season size, inundating forests and plains with nutrient-rich water. This annual pulse of fertility, this giving and taking away of water, created one of the most productive freshwater ecosystems on Earth. Fish teem in the expanding waters, feeding on the nutrients washed in from upstream. When the waters recede, they leave behind a fresh layer of silt perfect for rice cultivation. The ancient Khmer observed this natural bounty and conceived of something revolutionary, a civilization built upon the controlled capture, storage, and distribution of this seasonal abundance. Listen to the gentle sound of water moving across stone channels, the soft bubbling of controlled flow diverted from streams into reservoirs, the almost imperceptible seep of moisture into thirsty fields. These were the quiet symphonies that underpinned Khmer power. Not the clash of armies or the tumult of conquest, but the patient management of the element that brings life to all things. Beginning in the early 9th century and continuing for hundreds of years, Khmer rulers directed the construction of massive water management infrastructure across their territory. The most visible components were the berets, vast artificial reservoirs sometimes covering several square kilometers. The East Beret, constructed under King Yasovarman I around 900 CE, measured 7.5 kilometers long by 1.8 kilometers wide, holding approximately 50 million cubic meters of water. Later, the even larger West Beret would be built, spanning almost 8 kilometers in length and holding enough water to supply a modern city. Imagine standing on the embankment of such a reservoir at dawn. The water stretches to the horizon, perfectly still in the windless morning. Lotus flowers open with the first touch of sunlight, releasing their subtle fragrance. Waterbirds wade in the shallows, their movements creating concentric ripples across the glassy surface. In the distance, perhaps the faint silhouette of a temple rises from an island at the center, a sacred space surrounded by the life-giving waters. The scale of these constructions, completed without modern machinery, speaks to the organizational capacity of the Khmer state and the importance placed on water control. But the berets were only the most monumental components of a much more extensive hydraulic system. From these massive reservoirs, a network of channels, moats, dikes, and smaller ponds distributed water across the landscape. Some channels were designed for transportation, allowing boats to move goods efficiently between settlements. Others served purely irrigation purposes, delivering water to rice fields at precisely the right times in the growing cycle. The moats surrounding temples and cities served multiple functions: symbolic boundaries between sacred and profane space, defensive barriers, and additional water storage. The practical benefits of this water management were enormous. The ability to store monsoon rains allowed for multiple rice harvests each year rather than just one. Reliable irrigation reduced the risk of crop failure during dry spells. The controlled flooding of fields mimicked and enhanced the natural fertility cycle of the Tonle Sap. Fish cultivated in the reservoirs and channels provided crucial protein to complement the rice-based diet. Some scholars estimate that these agricultural innovations allowed the Angkorian Heartland to support population densities far beyond what would be possible with rainfall agriculture alone. Yet the hydraulic system was never merely utilitarian. Water in Khmer civilization carried profound symbolic weight, connecting earthly prosperity to cosmic order. The berets, typically oriented east-west, represented the celestial oceans of Hindu cosmology. Temple mountains rising from islands within these waters symbolized Mount Meru, the sacred center of the universe in Hindu and Buddhist traditions. When a king ordered the construction of a beret, he was not simply building infrastructure, but recreating the cosmos in miniature, demonstrating his harmony with divine principles. The connection between water management and royal legitimacy became a defining feature of Khmer kingship. Successful rulers demonstrated their merit through hydraulic projects that brought tangible benefits to their subjects, while simultaneously affirming their cosmic role. The elaborate consecration ceremonies for new reservoirs blended practical inauguration with spiritual sanctification, the waters blessed by Brahmin priests before being released to nurture the land. The construction process for these massive projects offers a window into Khmer social organization. Without heavy machinery, the movement of earth to form embankments and the quarrying and transportation of stone required enormous amounts of human labor. Some of this work was likely performed as a form of tax service, with villages supplying workers for royal projects during the agricultural off-season. Specialist engineers and architects would have overseen the design, ensuring proper gradients for water flow and stable construction of embankments. Skilled stonemasons carved the sandstone conduits and drainage structures that controlled water levels with remarkable precision. The sound of thousands of workers would have filled the air during these construction periods. The rhythmic thud of digging tools, the creak of ox carts laden with earth, the calls of supervisors coordinating the labor. Yet this was not the frantic pace of modern construction, but rather the measured tempo of pre-industrial work, following the rhythm of daylight and seasons, punctuated by rest periods and religious observances. For the ordinary farmer, the benefits of this hydraulic civilization were substantial, but came with obligations. The stability provided by irrigation reduced the precariousness of agricultural life, offering protection against the vagaries of rainfall. Yet this security was tied to participation in a hierarchical social system that directed surplus production toward the maintenance of religious establishments and the glory of the divine monarchy. The massive temples and reservoirs that still inspire awe today were built from the accumulated surplus of countless rice fields, transformed through royal direction into monuments of stone and water. In the quiet evening, as farmers returned from their fields to villages nestled among palm trees, the day's heat gradually subsiding, they might pause at the edge of an irrigation channel to wash away the soil of honest labour. The same waters that moistened their fields flowed eventually to the great berets surrounding sacred temples, and from there to the moats of the royal city. All were connected through this shared network, this circulation of the element that sustained everything from the humblest rice seedling to the most elaborate religious ritual. As darkness fell and oil lamps were lit in humble homes, the waters would continue their patient work, seeping through earth, nourishing roots, carrying boats on silent journeys through the night. The stones of temples and channels would hold the day's warmth, radiating it slowly back into the cooling air. These foundations of Khmer civilization, water and stone, operated on timeframes far beyond human lifespans, accumulating power and significance across generations, creating a legacy that would endure long after the empire itself had passed into history. As the first light of dawn breaks over the central plains of the Khmer Empire, life begins to stir in countless villages scattered across the landscape. Roosters announce the coming day, their calls echoing from one cluster of stilted wooden houses to the next. Smoke rises in thin columns from morning cooking fires, carrying the aromatic scent of rice porridge flavoured with dried fish and fresh herbs. Women move with quiet efficiency, preparing the first meal of the day while children fetch water from nearby wells or streams, their small feet padding along well-worn earth paths. The ordinary people who formed the foundation of Khmer civilization, perhaps 90% of the population, lived lives governed by the agricultural rhythms that have characterized rural Southeast Asia for millennia. Their homes, constructed of wood, bamboo, and thatch, were elevated on stilts to protect against seasonal flooding and provide cooler living spaces above the damp earth. Beneath these houses, in the shaded area created by the raised floor, families might keep a few chickens or pigs, or perhaps work on crafts during the hottest parts of the day. During the main growing season, the men and older boys would leave for the rice fields as the morning coolness lingered, carrying simple tools fashioned from wood and iron ploughs, hoes, sickles for harvesting. The soft swish of bare feet through dewy grass would gradually give way to the sound of labour. The grunt of water buffalo pulling ploughs through heavy soil, the rhythmic swinging of tools, the occasional call between workers coordinating their efforts across adjacent fields. Women often joined in agricultural work while also managing household affairs and childcare. Younger children might help by scaring birds away from ripening grain, their small voices raised in shouts as they ran through the fields waving strips of cloth. The elderly, their skin burnished by decades under the tropical sun, would contribute according to their abilities, watching infants, repairing tools and baskets, or preparing food for those working in the fields. The basic diet centered on rice, supplemented with fish from the abundant waterways, vegetables grown in garden plots near homes, and fruits gathered from forest edges or cultivated trees. Meals were flavoured with local herbs, fermented fish paste, prahok, and spices obtained through regional trade networks. Food preparation involved hours of patient work: rice to be husked and winnowed, fish to be cleaned and fermented or dried, vegetables to be washed and cut. The sound of stone mortars and pestles, used to pound rice or create spice pastes, provided a rhythmic backdrop to village life. Clothing was simple, but suited to the tropical climate. Common people typically wore cotton garments, sampots, a type of wraparound cloth, for men and longer skirts for women, sometimes with a separate piece of fabric draped across the upper body. For special occasions or temple visits, more elaborate clothing might be brought out from storage chests, perhaps featuring subtle patterns created through dyeing techniques. The wealthy and powerful, of course, enjoyed more luxurious textiles, silks in vibrant colours, sometimes embroidered with gold thread, designs that can still be seen in the bas-reliefs decorating temple walls. The passage of time was marked primarily by seasonal changes, rather than precise calendrical divisions. The agricultural year began with the onset of the monsoon rains, usually in May or June, when the parched earth finally softened enough for ploughing. The planting season was a time of intense labour, but also community cooperation, as households often exchanged labour to ensure all fields were planted efficiently. Throughout the growing season, farmers would maintain irrigation channels, monitor water levels, and protect crops from pests and diseases. Harvest brought another period of concentrated activity, with all available hands mobilized to gather the ripened grain before it could be damaged by late rains or wildlife. The successful completion of harvest was cause for celebration, with offerings made to local spirits and perhaps a special meal shared among those who had worked together. In areas benefiting from the elaborate Khmer irrigation systems, a second or even third crop might be planted, extending agricultural activities across much of the year. Between these agricultural demands, villagers engaged in a variety of supplementary activities. Fishing was particularly important, providing essential protein and flavorings for the largely vegetable-based diet. Men cast nets in rivers and ponds or set traps in flooded rice fields to catch the small fish that proliferated during the wet season. Women might gather edible plants from forest edges or cultivate small garden plots with vegetables and herbs. Hunting supplemented the diet with occasional meat, while the collection of forest products, resins, honey, medicinal plants, bamboo provided materials for household use or items to trade. Craft production occupied the agricultural off-season, or the hours when fieldwork was impossible. Women spun cotton and wove textiles on simple looms set up beneath their stilted houses. Men crafted tools, baskets, and household implements from bamboo, wood, and available metals. Some villages specialized in particular crafts: pottery made from local clay, iron tools forged in small furnaces, boats carved from massive tree trunks, creating goods that could be exchanged through local trade networks. Family structures centered on the nuclear family but existed within extended kinship networks that provided mutual support. Marriage typically occurred relatively young, with new couples often living near the bride's family for a period before establishing their own household. Children were valued both for the joy they brought and the contribution they would eventually make to family subsistence. Education was informal, with skills and knowledge passed directly from parents to children through observation, instruction, and practice. Only a small minority, typically boys destined for religious roles or administrative positions, received formal instruction in literacy and sacred texts. Religious life was deeply integrated into daily existence rather than compartmentalized as a separate domain. The majority of Khmer people practiced a form of Hinduism or Buddhism that incorporated substantial elements of indigenous animism and ancestor worship. Local spirits, the nectar, were believed to inhabit significant features of the landscape and required regular offerings and respectful treatment. Ancestors remained present in the community, requiring ritual attention at appropriate times. Village religious specialists, shamans, mediums, healers, facilitated communication with these local powers, while Brahmin priests or Buddhist monks associated with nearby temples conducted more formal ceremonies according to imported traditions. The sound of temple bells, the fragrance of incense, and the chanting of sacred texts would have been familiar, sensory experiences even for those who rarely participated in elaborate state rituals. The temple nearest to a village served as more than just a religious site. It was a community center, a place where local disputes might be resolved, celebrations held, and education provided. On holy days, villagers would put aside agricultural work to visit the temple, bringing offerings of food, flowers, or simple handicrafts. They might listen to monks recite sacred texts, observe or participate in rituals, and receive blessings for continued prosperity and well-being. These temple visits created a connection between the cosmic realm represented in sacred architecture and the lived reality of agricultural communities. The relationship between ordinary people and the state was mediated through a hierarchical system of local officials who oversaw tax collection, labor mobilization, and dispute resolution. Villagers owed various obligations to the state: a portion of their agricultural produce, labor service for construction projects or military campaigns, and sometimes specialized products from local craft production. In return, the state provided protection, dispute resolution mechanisms, and the maintenance of irrigation infrastructure that benefited agricultural production. Markets and trade networks connected villages to the wider economy. Regular markets might be held at crossroads or temple complexes, where agricultural surplus could be exchanged for craft goods, salt, and other necessities not produced locally. Travelling merchants occasionally brought more exotic items, metal implements, fine textiles, pottery from distant regions. The waterways that crisscrossed the Khmer landscape served as transportation routes, with boats carrying goods between settlements and eventually to the urban centres where wealth and power concentrated. As the sun reaches its zenith, activity in the village quiets. The intense midday heat encourages rest, with families retreating to the shade of their homes or nearby trees. Conversations slow to a murmur, punctuated by the drone of insects and perhaps the distant call of someone tending animals. This is a time for mending, for quiet handiwork, for stories told to drowsy children, tales of clever animals, powerful spirits, and the deeds of ancient heroes that connect each generation to the cultural memory of their ancestors. Late afternoon brings renewed activity as the worst heat subsides. Women prepare the evening meal while men return from the fields or complete household repairs. As twilight approaches, families gather to share food and conversation. Oil lamps or resin torches provide gentle illumination against the gathering darkness. The sounds of the day, human labour, animal noises, the bustle of domestic tasks gradually give way to evening sounds. The chirping of insects, the call of night birds, the low conversations of people unwinding after a day's work. Before sleep, there might be music, simple bamboo flutes, stringed instruments, or percussion creating melodies that have been passed down through generations. Perhaps an elder shares stories, or a young couple sits slightly apart, their courtship proceeding under the discreet supervision of family members. Eventually, as the night deepens, the village quiets completely. Families sleep on straw mats spread across the bamboo floors of their homes, the tropical air moving through open walls, carrying the sense of earth and vegetation, connecting the sleepers to the land that sustains them. This pattern of life, this quiet rhythm of agricultural existence, continued with little fundamental change across the centuries of Khmer dominance. While kings rose and fell, while magnificent temples were constructed and religious doctrines evolved, the essential experience of the majority remained tied to the cultivation of rice, the maintenance of family and community bonds, and the observation of seasonal and spiritual cycles that gave meaning and structure to existence. The strength and longevity of the Khmer Empire rested upon this foundation. Millions of ordinary lives lived in harmony with the natural environment, producing the surplus that supported the more visible achievements of the civilization. In the gentle persistence of these agricultural communities, we find perhaps the most enduring legacy of the Khmer, not in stone monuments, but in cultural practices and environmental adaptations that continue to sustain life in the region to this day.
In the cool interior of a Khmer temple, where sunlight filters through narrow openings to illuminate sandstone walls, the boundary between the human and divine realms seems to dissolve. Here, in these sacred spaces that punctuated the landscape of the empire, the Khmer people expressed their deepest understandings of the cosmos through art forms of extraordinary sophistication and beauty. Religion was not a separate domain of life, but rather the organizing principle through which all aspects of existence were understood and given meaning. The religious landscape of the Khmer Empire was complex and evolving, beginning with forms of Hinduism imported from India but gradually transformed through contact with indigenous beliefs and later Buddhist influences. Throughout most of the Angkorian period, Hinduism, particularly the worship of Shiva and Vishnu, dominated official state religion and royal patronage. However, this was never an exclusive adherence. Rather, it existed within a pluralistic religious environment where multiple traditions could coexist and intermingle. Shiva, the great destroyer and regenerator in the Hindu trinity, held special significance in early Khmer religious practice. He was represented primarily through the linga, a phallic stone symbol housed in the central sanctuary of temples. The linga represented the abstract creative power of the divine, often placed upon a yoni, female counterpart, symbolizing the productive union of cosmic forces. These seemingly simple forms contained profound theological significance, embodying concepts of creation, potency, and the continuation of existence through cycles of destruction and renewal. Vishnu, the preserver deity, gained prominence during certain reigns, most notably under Suryavarman II, builder of Angkor Wat. Vishnu was typically depicted in anthropomorphic form, often with forearms holding his distinctive attributes: a conch shell, discus, mace, and lotus flower. His ability to manifest in various avatars, incarnations to restore cosmic order, made him particularly suitable as a patron deity for kings seeking to position themselves as divine instruments of universal harmony. Local artistic traditions transformed these Indian religious concepts into distinctively Khmer expressions. Stone carvers developed techniques for creating images of extraordinary delicacy and sensual beauty. The famous apsaras, celestial dancers that adorn temple walls, capture a uniquely Khmer aesthetic. Figures poised in dance positions with graceful limbs, elaborate headdresses, and expressions of serene concentration. Depicted by the thousands across temple complexes, these divine beings were believed to entertain the gods with their perpetual dance, their frozen movements suggesting both the eternal nature of divine realms and the fleeting beauty of artistic performance. The surfaces of temple walls became canvases for elaborate narratives drawn from Hindu epics, the Ramayana and Mahabharata, as well as historical events and scenes from court life. These bas-reliefs, carved with remarkable attention to detail, served multiple purposes. They illustrated sacred stories for those unable to read religious texts. They demonstrated royal piety through the patronage of religious art. And they connected Khmer kingship to divine models of righteous rule from Indian tradition. Imagine walking along these carved galleries in the gentle light of early morning. Your fingers might trail lightly across stone that has been shaped to depict armies of monkeys assisting the god Prince Rama in his battle against the demon king Ravana, or the churning of the cosmic ocean by gods and demons to produce the elixir of immortality. The cool touch of sandstone against your skin, the subtle interplay of light and shadow across carved surfaces, the gradual revelation of narrative as you move through space. These sensory experiences were integral to the religious function of the art, creating an embodied connection to sacred stories. Bronze casting reached exceptional heights under Khmer artisans. Small devotional statues of deities produced using the lost wax method achieved a level of refinement and technical perfection that ranks among the world's great metallurgical traditions. The distinctive Khmer style featured idealized human forms with specific iconographic attributes, identifying particular deities. The metal itself, an alloy of copper with tin, lead, or gold, would have had a warm luster when newly cast, though centuries of weathering have given surviving examples the characteristic green patina we associate with ancient bronzes. The creation of these sacred objects involved both technical expertise and ritual knowledge. Metallurgists mastered the complex processes of alloying metals for specific properties, creating detailed clay molds, and achieving the precise temperatures needed for successful casting. Yet the production was equally a spiritual act, accompanied by ceremonies to ensure the deity being represented would consent to inhabit the finished image. The boundary between craftsperson and priest blurred in these acts of sacred creation. Textiles played a crucial role in both religious ritual and the expression of status, though few examples have survived the tropical climate. Bas-reliefs depict elaborately patterned clothing worn by royalty and deities, suggesting sophisticated weaving techniques including brocade and ikat methods. Cotton was widely grown, while silk production became increasingly important, with patterns and techniques showing influence from both Indian and Chinese traditions, but developed into distinctly Khmer styles. Sacred dances, the human counterparts to the apsaras carved in stone, performed elaborate choreography that linked the Khmer court to divine realms. These dancers were not mere entertainers, but religious practitioners whose movements constituted a form of prayer and meditation. Their performances, accompanied by orchestras of bronze drums, gongs, string instruments, and flutes, created multisensory religious experiences that temporarily transformed ordinary space into cosmic realms. The dancers' costumes would have glittered with gold thread and jewels, their precisely articulated hand gestures, mudras, and stylized poses conveying specific religious narratives and emotions. The sound of ankle bells marking rhythmic footwork, the subtle fragrance of flowers adorning elaborate headdresses, the visual impact of synchronized movement, all combined to create experiences that engaged every sense in religious contemplation. Imagine the atmosphere of such performances at twilight, perhaps in a temple courtyard or palace enclosure. Torches and oil lamps cast flickering light across the scene, creating an otherworldly ambience. The measured tempo of the pinpeat orchestra, the metallic resonance of gongs and xylophones, the haunting tones of reed instruments established the ritual space. As the dancers moved with deliberate grace through choreography unchanged for generations, the boundaries between performer, audience, and deity might momentarily dissolve. Architecture served as perhaps the most monumental expression of Khmer religious concepts. The temple mountain design that characterized major religious foundations physically manifested the sacred Mount Meru of Hindu cosmology, the axis mundi connecting earthly and celestial realms. These structures were not simply places of worship, but cosmological diagrams built in stone, their precise orientation to cardinal directions and graduated elevation symbolizing the hierarchy of existence from the mundane to the divine. The experience of approaching and entering such temples was carefully choreographed to reinforce religious messages. Long causeways elevated above water represented the bridge between the human and divine worlds. Concentric enclosures created increasingly sacred space as one moved inward. The gradual ascent toward the central towers mirrored spiritual elevation. At each level, carved guardians and deities appropriate to that cosmic tier greeted the visitor. The journey culminated in the darkened central sanctuary housing the primary deity, a space where intimate communion between human and divine became possible. The sensory experience of these sacred spaces was carefully managed. The transition from bright tropical sunlight to cool, shadowed interiors created a physical sensation of moving between worlds. The acoustic properties of stone chambers amplified the sounds of chanting and ritual instruments. The fragrance of incense and offerings of flowers permeated the atmosphere. These multisensory elements were not incidental, but essential to the religious function of the spaces, creating embodied experiences of cosmological principles. With the gradual ascendance of Mahayana Buddhism during the reign of Jayavarman VII, late 12th century, new religious imagery and concepts entered Khmer sacred expression. The compassionate bodhisattva, Avalokiteshvara, gained particular prominence, often depicted with multiple arms radiating outward like the rays of the sun, symbolizing his ability to reach and aid all suffering beings. The enigmatic face towers of the Bayon, with their gentle smiles and downcast eyes, represented this bodhisattva's omnipresent compassion watching over the kingdom. Theravada Buddhism, which would eventually become the dominant religion of the region, began its gradual rise in the 13th century. Its emphasis on monastic practice and individual spiritual effort, rather than elaborate ritual or divine kingship, would ultimately contribute to significant social and political transformations. The artistic expressions of this tradition favored simpler imagery, focused on the historical Buddha and scenes from his life, marking a shift away from the pantheon of deities that had characterized earlier periods. Throughout these religious evolutions, certain fundamental concepts remained consistent in Khmer sacred art. The human body idealized, proportional, and graceful as the primary vehicle for expressing divine presence. Narrative remained essential, with visual storytelling complementing oral and textual traditions. Most importantly, art was never merely decorative, but fundamentally functional in a religious sense. Objects and images were activated through ritual to become genuine connections between human and divine realms. For ordinary people, religious art created points of access to cosmic power that might otherwise seem remote. A farmer might pause before a relief depicting a familiar story from the Ramayana, momentarily connecting his daily struggles to the universal battle between dharma, righteousness, and adharma, chaos. A woman making offerings at a temple might gaze upon the serene face of a deity and find both comfort in its compassion and inspiration for her own spiritual development. These encounters with sacred art were not passive but interactive, creating dialogue between viewer and image that enriched religious understanding. As darkness falls and temple courtyards grow quiet, perhaps a single lamp remains lit before a bronze Buddha or stone linga. In this gentle illumination, the accumulated spiritual energy of countless prayers and offerings seems to concentrate, making the boundary between material and spiritual momentarily permeable. This is the legacy of Khmer sacred expression, not simply artistic achievement, though that is remarkable in itself, but the creation of points of contact between ordinary human experience and the expansive spiritual dimensions that give it meaning. In these quiet moments of connection, facilitated by objects of extraordinary beauty and symbolic complexity, we find the heart of Khmer religious art. A tradition that transformed stone, metal, movement, and sound into bridges between worlds, allowing the divine to become momentarily visible within the flow of ordinary time. As the 10th century gave way to the 11th, the Khmer Empire entered a period of unprecedented prosperity and expansion under the leadership of two remarkable kings, Suryavarman, the Forced Six, who reigned from approximately 102 to 1050 CE, and his successor Udayadityavarman II, who ruled until around 1066 CE. Together, these monarchs established patterns of governance, territorial control, and monumental construction that defined what historians now recognize as the beginning of the Angkorian Golden Age. Suryavarman, I came to power through conquest, unifying territories that had fragmented following earlier imperial consolidations. His name, combining the Sanskrit words for sun, Surya and shield, or protection, Varman embodied his role as a warrior king who would extend his protective authority across an expanding realm. Unlike many usurpers throughout history, however, Suryavarman appears to have quickly established legitimacy, creating stability that would endure throughout his long reign. The landscape through which Suryavarman's armies moved would have been a patchwork of agricultural settlements, interspersed with areas of forest and swamp. Rivers and ancient roadways provided the primary routes for troop movements, with elephants carrying commanders and supplies, while infantry traversed difficult terrain on foot. The sound of bronze war drums, conch shell trumpets, and marching men would have announced the approach of royal forces, bringing either the promise of protection or the threat of subjugation, depending on one's relationship to the expanding center of power. Suryavarman consolidated his control through a combination of military prowess, strategic marriage alliances, and religious legitimation. Inscriptions from his reign describe campaigns extending Khmer influence westward into territories of present-day Thailand, previously under Mon control. These military expeditions were not merely about territorial acquisition, but about incorporating new populations and resources into the imperial system, extending the networks of tribute and obligation that sustained the Angkorian state. Perhaps Suryavarman's most significant innovation was his reorganization of imperial administration. He established a more centralized bureaucracy, creating a core of officials personally loyal to him rather than to regional powers. These officials were dispatched throughout the empire to oversee tax collection, labor mobilization, and judicial functions, creating more direct connections between the royal court and local communities. The rustle of palm leaf documents being examined, the measured tones of royal pronouncements being read aloud in village gatherings, the careful recording of tax obligations. These were the quiet sounds of state formation that accompanied the more dramatic campaigns of territorial expansion. Imagine a royal official arriving at a provincial center, perhaps carried in a palanquin accompanied by guards and lesser bureaucrats. His appearance, the quality of his clothing, his insignia of office, perhaps a royal parasol indicating delegated authority, immediately communicates his position in the imperial hierarchy. Local elites gather to receive him, offering appropriate gifts and demonstrations of respect. In a pavilion constructed for the occasion, he might review records of rice production, resolve pending disputes, or announce new royal directives. Such scenes, multiplied across hundreds of settlements throughout the empire, represent the practical implementation of Suryavarman's administrative vision. The religious dimension of Suryavarman's rule reflected the complex spiritual landscape of the period. Though his name suggests solar symbolism associated with Surya or Vishnu, inscriptional evidence indicates he primarily honored Shiva, continuing the pattern of earlier Khmer rulers. However, his religious patronage was ecumenical, supporting various Hindu sects and showing respect for Buddhist communities within his realm. This religious pluralism, operating within an overarching framework of divine kingship, would remain characteristic of the Khmer Empire throughout much of its history. Suryavarman's most enduring physical legacy was his expansion of Angkor itself. He constructed a vast new royal palace complex and enhanced the growing urban infrastructure of roads, residences, and religious foundations. His own state temple, known today as Phnom, formed part of what would later become the royal palace enclosure. Though modest in scale compared to later temples, this pyramidal structure continued the tradition of creating sacred mountains at the center of royal power, physically manifesting the king's connection to divine authority. When Udayadityavarman II ascended the throne following Suryavarman's death, he inherited an empire more extensive and better administered than any previous Khmer state. His reign would be characterized by both continuity with his predecessors' policies and ambitious new initiatives that pushed the boundaries of Khmer engineering and architectural achievement. The most spectacular monument of Udayadityavarman's reign was his state temple, the Bafwan. This massive temple mountain rose in multiple tiers to a height of around 35 meters, its original form resembling a stepped pyramid crowned with towers. Dedicated to Shiva, the Bafwan represented the most ambitious expression yet of the Temple Mountain concept, requiring the quarrying, transportation, and precise placement of enormous quantities of stone. The logistics of this construction, thousands of workers coordinated across years of effort, stone blocks moved from distant quarries, intricate carvings executed according to precise theological specifications, testify to the organizational capacity of the Khmer state at this point in its development. Imagine the construction site at dawn as the day's work begins. Stone dust hangs in the air, catching the first rays of sunlight. The rhythmic sound of stone masons' tools creates a percussive backdrop as blocks are shaped to fit precisely with their neighbors. Architects consult models and plans, ensuring alignment with cosmological principles. Engineers direct the operation of pulleys and ramps that allow massive stones to be raised to ever higher levels. Priests perform daily rituals to ensure divine favor for the project. The scent of incense mingles with the earthier smells of human labor. These scenes of coordinated effort, repeated day after day across decades, gradually transformed abstract cosmological concepts into physical reality. Beyond temple construction, Udayadityavarman's most significant contribution to the empire was his expansion of the hydraulic infrastructure that supported Angkorian agriculture. The Western Baray, an artificial reservoir measuring 8 kilometers long by 2 kilometers wide, represents one of the largest hydraulic engineering projects of the pre-industrial world. This massive undertaking required excavating and removing approximately 16 million cubic meters of earth to create a reservoir capable of storing 53 million cubic meters of water. The Western Baray served multiple functions within the Angkorian system. Practically, it provided water storage for irrigation, allowing for agricultural production during dry periods. Symbolically, it represented the celestial oceans of Hindu cosmology, with the small temple of West Mebon on an artificial island at its center, representing Mount Meru rising from the cosmic waters. Politically, it demonstrated the king's ability to mobilize vast resources and transform the landscape itself, a physical manifestation of royal power visible across kilometers of territory. The construction of this enormous reservoir would have been a multi-year project involving thousands of workers. During the dry season, when agricultural demands were lowest, villages throughout the region would have contributed labor as a form of tax obligation. The coordinated movement of earth using simple tools, baskets, hoes, carrying poles, required careful planning and supervision. The embankments had to be properly compacted to hold water without erosion. Inlet and outlet structures needed precise engineering to control water levels. The scale of the undertaking suggests a sophisticated understanding of hydrology, soil mechanics, and labor management. The Western Baray remains in existence today, visible in satellite imagery as a perfect rectangle inscribed upon the landscape west of Angkor Wat. Though no longer functioning at full capacity, it stands as testament to the engineering knowledge and organizational capability of the 11th century Khmer state. For contemporary visitors, it appears simply as a large lake, its artificial nature not immediately obvious. This seamless integration of human construction with the natural environment characterized much of Khmer environmental modification, working with natural processes rather than imposing rigid forms upon them. Both Suryavarman I and Udayadityavarman III faced challenges to their authority, including rebellions that required military suppression. Inscriptions record campaigns against provincial leaders who attempted to assert independence, suggesting that the centralization of power was neither complete nor uncontested. The maintenance of imperial control required constant attention, with ritual displays of royal authority complemented by the occasional application of force against those who challenged the established order. Court life during this period reached new levels of sophistication and ceremonial complexity. The daily routines of monarchy involved elaborate rituals designed to reinforce the cosmic significance of royal actions. Each morning, the king would emerge from his private chambers to be ritually bathed and dressed by attendants. Brahmin priests would perform ceremonies to ensure divine protection throughout the day. Court officials would present matters requiring royal attention according to strict protocols of precedence and etiquette. Public appearances were carefully staged to maximize the visual impact of royal presence, with parasols, processional regalia, and formal arrangements of courtiers creating living tableau of political hierarchy. Imagine the scene as the king receives foreign envoys in the royal audience hall. Light filters through openings in the wooden structure, creating patterns across the floor covered with precious carpets. The king sits elevated on a golden throne, surrounded by the insignia of his authority. Court officials arrange themselves according to rank, their positions physically manifesting the structure of government. Musicians play softly in the background, their melodies establishing an atmosphere of refined culture. The foreign visitors approach with carefully rehearsed gestures of respect, bearing gifts that symbolize the relationship between their homeland and the Khmer Empire. Such diplomatic encounters, recorded in stone inscriptions and occasionally in the accounts of foreign visitors, connected Angkor to a wider world of trade and cultural exchange, stretching across Southeast Asia and beyond. The economic foundations of the empire continued to rest primarily on rice agriculture, supplemented by trade in luxury goods and forest products. The expansion of the hydraulic infrastructure under these rulers increased agricultural productivity, generating greater surpluses that could support specialized craft production, religious establishments, and the growing administrative apparatus of the state. Markets in urban centers and at major temples facilitated exchange of goods, with transactions often conducted using measures of rice or other commodities rather than standardized currency. By the time of Udayadityavarman's death around 1066 CE, the Khmer Empire had achieved a level of political integration, economic productivity, and cultural sophistication unprecedented in Southeast Asian history. The foundations laid during these reigns, administrative systems, hydraulic infrastructure, architectural traditions, patterns of religious patronage. As twilight falls across the western Beret, with fishing boats returning to shore after a day harvesting the reservoir's aquatic bounty, one might reflect on how these massive engineering works transformed not just the physical landscape, but the social and political possibilities of the region. The expanded agricultural production supported population growth and urbanization. The demonstrated capacity of the state to organize labor on an unprecedented scale reinforced royal authority and prestige. The integration of practical infrastructure with cosmological symbolism strengthened the ideological foundations of divine kingship. In the cool evening air, as oil lamps are lit in villages across the empire, the achievements of these early Golden Age rulers continue to shape the lives of their subjects, from the official implementing royal decrees in a provincial centre, to the farmer whose fields receive water from the vast hydraulic system, to the stone carver whose work adorns ever more elaborate temple complexes. The stage is now set for the most magnificent architectural expression of Khmer civilization, a temple that would become synonymous with the empire itself. In the early morning light, when mist still clings to the lotus-filled moats, and the tropical sun has not yet asserted its full strength, Angkor Wat reveals itself with a quiet grandeur that transcends mere architectural achievement. The massive temple complex rises from the landscape like a vision made permanent, a perfect balance of soaring ambition and harmonious proportion. This is the legacy of King Suryavarman II, who ruled the Khmer Empire from approximately 1113 to 1150 CE, and created what would become one of humanity's most enduring monuments. Suryavarman II came to power during a period of political uncertainty following the death of Udayadityavarman II. His early reign appears to have involved consolidating control against rival claimants, though details of these power struggles remain limited in the historical record. What is clear is that once established, he embarked on an ambitious program of military expansion, administrative reform, and monumental construction that would define his reign as one of the most significant in Khmer history. Inscriptions and bas-reliefs from the period depict Suryavarman as a warrior king who personally led military campaigns to extend Khmer influence. His armies pushed the boundaries of the empire further into present-day Thailand and Laos, while also campaigning against the Dai Viet Vietnamese kingdom to the east and the Champa kingdom to the southeast. These military expeditions were not merely about territorial control, but about establishing tributary relationships that brought wealth and prestige to the Angkorian center. Imagine Suryavarman reviewing his troops before such a campaign. Elephants adorned with ceremonial armor and carrying commanders stand in formation. Infantry units display their weapons, spears, bows, swords, while officers signal readiness with decorative banners. The king himself might be elevated on a royal elephant or ceremonial palanquin, his appearance carefully designed to project divine authority and martial prowess. Brahmin priests perform rituals to ensure victory, the scent of sacred fires and offerings mingling with the earthier smells of assembled men and animals. These military displays, captured in the detailed bas-reliefs of Angkor Wat itself, demonstrate how warfare was conducted as much through symbolic demonstration of power as through actual combat. Despite his military focus, Suryavarman's most enduring legacy would be not conquest, but creation. His decision to break with tradition and dedicate his state temple to Vishnu rather than Shiva signaled a significant religious shift. While both deities had been worshipped in the Khmer Empire previously, Suryavarman's particular devotion to Vishnu, the preserver deity in the Hindu Trinity, may reflect his vision of himself as a protector and sustainer of cosmic order rather than an agent of transformation or destruction. The conception of Angkor Wat represents one of history's most ambitious architectural visions. Unlike previous state temples that were designed primarily as temple mountains, with central towers representing Mount Meru, Angkor Wat combined this vertical symbolism with a new emphasis on horizontal galleries and courtyards that could accommodate larger numbers of worshippers and elaborate ritual processions. The temple was oriented to the west rather than the more traditional east, possibly associating it with Vishnu or perhaps indicating its eventual function as a funerary temple for Suryavarman himself. The scale of the monument still inspires awe. The outer walls enclose an area of 820,000 square meters, 2,003 acres. The moat surrounding these walls measures 190 meters wide and creates a reflection of the temple that doubles its visual impact while symbolizing the cosmic oceans. The central temple structure rises in 3 rectangular galleries of increasing elevation, culminating in 5 towers arranged in a quincunx pattern, 4 at the corners and 1, taller than the others, at the center. These towers, shaped like lotus buds, represent the 5 peaks of Mount Meru. Construction would have begun with extensive site preparation, clearing land, establishing precise elevational references, and preparing foundations capable of supporting enormous weight. The stone, primarily sandstone, with some laterite for hidden structural elements, was quarried from the Kulen Hills some 40 kilometers distant. Blocks weighing up to 1.5 tons were transported, likely using a combination of water routes and overland movement on wooden rollers. At the construction site, these blocks were fitted with such precision that in many places the joints are nearly invisible, despite the absence of mortar. The logistics of this undertaking challenge modern comprehension. Approximately 5 to 10 million sandstone blocks were quarried, transported, carved, and placed with extraordinary precision. Some scholars estimate that construction would have required around 300,000 workers and craftspeople, including specialized stone carvers, engineers, architects, and laborers. The project likely continued throughout Suryavarman's reign and perhaps beyond, representing a multi-generational commitment to creating a monument of unprecedented scale and beauty. Imagine the construction site as work progresses. Teams of stonemasons use iron chisels and wooden mallets to shape blocks according to architectural specifications. Artists carve detailed reliefs following templates established by master designers. Engineers direct the placement of stones using pulleys, levers, and earthen ramps to raise materials to ever greater heights. Surveyors check alignments to ensure the perfect symmetry that characterizes the finished structure. Everywhere is the sound of stone against stone, the calls of supervisors directing operations, the rhythmic work songs of laborers coordinating their efforts. The air is filled with stone dust that catches the tropical sunlight, creating a hazy atmosphere through which the emerging temple gradually takes form. The completed temple was not simply a static monument, but a dynamic ritual space designed for specific religious functions. The extensive galleries surrounding the central sanctuary would have accommodated elaborate ceremonial processions, with the king and religious specialists moving through precisely choreographed sequences that enacted cosmic dramas. The Western orientation of the temple created opportunities for specific light effects, with the setting sun illuminating the main entrance and creating symbolic connections to Vishnu's associations with the West. The decorative program of Angkor Wat represents one of history's most extensive narrative cycles rendered in stone. Nearly 600 meters of bas-reliefs run along the outer gallery walls, depicting scenes from Hindu mythology alongside historical events from Suryavarman's reign. These carvings served multiple purposes. They illustrated sacred stories for those who could not read religious texts, documented contemporary achievements for posterity, and demonstrated the king's legitimacy by associating his rule with divine precedents. Among the most famous sections is the Churning of the Ocean of Milk relief, which depicts a pivotal Hindu creation myth. In this story, gods and demons cooperate to churn the cosmic ocean using the serpent Vasuki as a rope and Mount Mandara as a churning pole, eventually producing Amrita, the elixir of immortality. The relief shows 92 asuras, demons, and 88 devas, gods engaged in this cosmic task, their bodies rendered with remarkable attention to muscular tension and physical effort. The scene serves as a metaphor for the cooperation of opposing forces to produce spiritual transformation, a theme with relevance to both religious understanding and political governance. Equally impressive is the extensive depiction of the Battle of Lanka from the Ramayana epic, showing the god prince Rama's conflict with the demon king Ravana, who had abducted Rama's wife Sita. The narrative unfolds across multiple panels, with armies of monkeys and demons engaged in combat, their formations, weapons, and battle tactics rendered in remarkable detail. These scenes connected contemporary Khmer military campaigns to sacred precedents, suggesting that Suryavarman's own wars were similarly struggles between cosmic order and chaos. Beyond these narrative sections, the temple is adorned with more than 3,000 apsaras, celestial dancers, each carved with individual characteristics rather than mass-produced repetitions. These figures, with their elaborate headdresses, graceful poses, and enigmatic smiles, represent the artistic pinnacle of Khmer stone carving. They were not merely decorative, but served as mediators between human and divine realms, their perpetual dance symbolizing the harmony of the cosmos under righteous rule. For a visitor approaching Angkor Wat during Suryavarman's time, the experience would have unfolded as a carefully orchestrated spiritual journey. After crossing the vast moat via the Western Causeway, they would pass through the monumental Gopura gateway in the outer wall, entering a space that symbolically separated the mundane world from sacred precinct. The first view of the temple proper would present its perfect symmetry and westward orientation, with the morning sun illuminating the towers from behind, or the setting sun creating a dramatic silhouette. Moving along the cruciform terrace toward the temple, the visitor would begin to discern the detailed carvings adorning every available surface. Entering the outer gallery, they would encounter the massive narrative reliefs, perhaps guided by priests who could explain the theological significance of the scenes depicted. Proceeding inward and upward through successive enclosures, each threshold marking a transition to more sacred space, they would eventually reach the central tower housing the principal image of Vishnu. This journey from periphery to center, from lower to higher elevation, from public space to sacred enclosure, physically enacted the spiritual journey from ordinary consciousness toward divine understanding. The architecture itself served as a three-dimensional mandala, a cosmic diagram designed to transform those who moved through its spaces. The progressive darkening of interior spaces as one moved inward created sensory conditions conducive to contemplation, while the decreasing noise from the outer precincts enhanced the atmosphere of sacred silence at the heart of the complex. The religious life centered on Angkor Wat would have involved daily rituals performed by a permanent staff of priests, as well as larger ceremonies marking significant calendar events or royal occasions. Offerings of flowers, incense, food, and precious items would be presented before the divine images. Sacred texts would be recited or chanted, their Sanskrit syllables resonating through stone chambers designed to enhance acoustic properties. Processions would move through galleries according to ritual prescriptions, the sound of music accompanying movements that enacted cosmic patterns. For the majority of the population, participation in these temple activities would have been limited to major festivals or specific ritual occasions. Ordinary people might bring simple offerings and observe ceremonies from designated areas, but access to inner sanctuaries would be restricted to religious specialists and high-ranking individuals. Nevertheless, the temple stood as a visible manifestation of divine power accessible to all, its towering presence on the landscape a constant reminder of the cosmic order underlying everyday existence. Suryavarman II's reign represented the high water mark of Khmer military power and territorial extent. Under his rule, the empire expanded its influence across much of mainland Southeast Asia, with tributary relationships extending the reach of Angkorian authority beyond directly administered territories. This political achievement, however impressive, proved less enduring than his architectural legacy. After his death, around 1150 CE, the empire he had expanded would face serious challenges from resurgent neighboring powers. The circumstances of Suryavarman's death remain unclear in historical records. Some evidence suggests he may have died during a military campaign against the Dai Viet kingdom, though details are sparse. What is certain is that his passing created a power vacuum that would lead to a period of instability, culminating in one of the most traumatic events in Angkorian history: the sack of the capital by Cham forces in 1177 CE. As twilight deepens and the last visitors leave the temple precincts, Angkor Wat assumes yet another aspect. Moonlight transforms the sandstone from warm gold to cool silver, creating new patterns of light and shadow across carved surfaces. The massive towers become silhouettes against the star-filled sky. In this nocturnal transfiguration, the temple reveals its enduring quality, its ability to transcend the specific religious and political contexts of its creation and speak across centuries about human aspirations toward beauty, meaning, and transcendence. This is perhaps Suryavarman II's greatest achievement, not simply the creation of a monument to his own rule or even to his patron deity, but the manifestation in stone of universal principles that continue to inspire contemplation and wonder nearly a millennium after the last chisel fell silent. In the perfect proportions of Angkor Wat, in its harmonious integration of architectural mass with delicate artistic detail, in its ambitious scope and meticulous execution, we find an expression of human creativity that transcends its original functions to become a shared inheritance of all humanity. The decades following Suryavarman II's death marked a period of mounting challenges for the Khmer Empire. The momentum of expansion that had characterized his reign gradually dissipated, replaced by defensive struggles against increasingly assertive neighbors. This was not a sudden collapse, but rather a series of setbacks and partial recoveries that tested the resilience of the imperial system. Through these trials, we witness both the vulnerabilities and the remarkable durability of the civilization centered at Angkor. After Suryavarman II died around 1150 CE, a succession of less effective rulers struggled to maintain the empire's expanded boundaries. The historical record for this period becomes somewhat fragmented, with fewer inscriptions providing details of events. What does emerge clearly is that the Kingdom of Champa, located in what is now central Vietnam, seized the opportunity presented by Angkor's leadership transitions to reassert its independence, and eventually mount increasingly bold counterattacks against Khmer territory. The Chams had long maintained a complex relationship with the Khmer Empire, sometimes tributary allies, sometimes fierce competitors for regional influence. Their civilization, heavily influenced by Indian cultural forms like the Khmer, but with distinct characteristics shaped by maritime connections to island Southeast Asia, had developed sophisticated military capabilities, including naval forces that could navigate both coastal waters and inland riverways. These amphibious capabilities would prove decisive in the coming conflict. By the 170s, the Cham ruler Jayavarman IV had consolidated his position and began planning a major offensive against the Khmer. Rather than engaging in the border skirmishes that had characterized previous conflicts, he prepared a bold strike at the heart of Angkorian power. In 1177, a Cham fleet navigated up the Mekong River and then through Tonle Sap Lake, approaching Angkor from a direction where defenses may have been less developed. Imagine the scene as the Cham forces moved through the waterways of the Khmer Heartland. Long war canoes, perhaps with distinctive serpent head prows, move silently through early morning mist. Warriors with lashed spears and bows crouch low, their approach hidden by reeds and water vegetation. Scouts move ahead of the main force, reporting on defensive positions and troop movements. The invasion force navigates through the complex hydrology that had been developed to support Khmer agriculture, turning the empire's irrigation infrastructure into a highway for its enemies. The attack on Angkor itself appears to have been both unexpected and devastatingly effective. Inscriptions describe the Cham forces as arriving like lightning, suggesting the element of surprise played a crucial role in their success. The city's defenses, designed primarily to display symbolic power rather than withstand determined assault, proved inadequate against this novel approach. The Khmer ruler Udayadityavarman was killed in the fighting, creating a leadership vacuum at the most critical moment. What followed was one of the most traumatic episodes in Angkorian history. The Cham forces occupied and looted the capital, including its sacred temples and royal treasuries. Contemporary accounts describe widespread destruction, though the exact extent of physical damage to monuments remains debated among historians. What is clear is the psychological impact of this violation of the imperial center, a profound shock to a society that had come to view Angkorian dominance as an expression of cosmic order. Try to envision Angkor in the aftermath of this catastrophe. Smoke rises from burned wooden structures within the city. Temple doorways stand broken open, their sacred contents removed or desecrated. Residents who fled during the attack begin to return cautiously, searching for family members and assessing damages. Court officials who survived attempt to re-establish basic administrative functions without royal leadership. The cosmic harmony that Angkorian urbanism was designed to manifest has been disrupted, creating both practical and spiritual crises that demanded resolution. This moment of extreme vulnerability could have marked the beginning of the end for the Khmer Empire. That it did not is largely due to the emergence of a leader who would become one of the most significant figures in Southeast Asian history. Jayavarman VII. At the time of the Cham invasion, he was apparently a prince living in exile, possibly having left Angkor during earlier succession disputes. The details of his early life remain obscure, but what is clear is that he recognized both the danger and the opportunity presented by the Cham occupation. Over the next few years, Jayavarman gathered forces loyal to him and began a systematic campaign to expel the Cham occupiers and re-establish Khmer control. This was not a single, decisive battle, but a gradual process of reasserting authority across a fragmented landscape. By 1181, he had succeeded in driving out the Cham forces and declared himself king, establishing a new dynasty that would preside over a remarkable period of reconstruction and transformation. The conflict between Angkor and Champa did not end with the liberation of the capital. Jayavarman VII pursued a strategy of counter-invasion, eventually subjugating Champa and incorporating it into his expanding empire. This reversal of fortunes was complete and dramatic, from the nadir of occupation to the zenith of territorial expansion in the span of less than a decade. Yet the experience of vulnerability left lasting marks on Jayavarman's approach to rulership and his vision for the renewed empire. Beyond the Cham invasion, this period witnessed other external pressures on the Khmer Empire. To the west, pagan, in present-day Myanmar, had consolidated into a powerful kingdom that competed with Angkor for influence in the region. Thai peoples were beginning their migration into territories previously dominated by Mon and Khmer populations, creating new political dynamics that would eventually transform the geopolitics of mainland Southeast Asia. Maritime trade was shifting toward ports that could better accommodate the growing commerce with China, potentially reducing the economic influence of inland powers like Angkor. These external challenges coincided with internal stresses that had been developing within the imperial system. The enormous construction projects of previous reigns had placed heavy demands on population and resources. The hydraulic infrastructure that supported intensive agriculture required constant maintenance to function effectively. Religious foundations had accumulated substantial landholdings and personnel, creating institutional power centers that could potentially compete with royal authority. These structural tensions did not produce immediate crisis, but created vulnerabilities that became evident during periods of external pressure. For ordinary people living through these troubled times, the experience would have varied dramatically depending on location and social position. Those in the Angkorian heartland directly experienced the trauma of invasion and occupation, with attendant violence, dislocation, and economic disruption. Agricultural communities may have seen their irrigation systems damaged or maintenance neglected during periods of political instability. Trade networks were likely disrupted, affecting the availability of goods and materials from distant regions. Yet, it is important to recognize the resilience inherent in the decentralized nature of agricultural production. While monumental construction and elite consumption depended on centralized collection of surplus, the basic subsistence of village communities remained largely self-contained. Even during periods when imperial authority weakened, local systems of production and social organization continued to function, providing a foundation for eventual recovery. The endurance of these local structures helps explain how the Khmer civilization could weather serious shocks without fundamental collapse. As Jayavarman VII consolidated his position and began implementing his vision for imperial renewal, the mood would have gradually shifted from crisis to cautious optimism. The return of stable authority, the resumption of religious rituals that maintained cosmic harmony, and the initiation of reconstruction projects all signaled that the darkest period had passed. Yet the memory of vulnerability remained, informing both practical policies and symbolic expressions of the renewed imperial order. This period of trial revealed both the strengths and weaknesses of the Angkorian system. Its vulnerability to unexpected military approaches highlighted the limits of imperial defense when confronted with innovative tactics. The disruption caused by leadership transitions demonstrated the importance of stable succession mechanisms in maintaining political continuity. Yet the ultimate recovery from occupation and the successful counter-projection of power showed remarkable resilience in the face of what could have been a civilization-ending catastrophe. As night falls over the Angkorian plain in these years of recovery, the glow of construction fires would have been visible across the landscape, evidence of the massive rebuilding program being launched under Jayavarman VII. Teams of workers labored through the evening hours, illuminated by torchlight as they cleared debris, prepared foundations, and began the ambitious projects that would transform the capital. These points of light in the darkness symbolized the empire's renewal, its refusal to accept defeat as final, its determination to recreate sacred order from the chaos of recent memory. The trials of this period ultimately strengthened rather than weakened the Khmer Empire, at least in the short term. They created conditions for leadership change that brought to power one of the most energetic and visionary rulers in Southeast Asian history. They prompted defensive innovations and infrastructure development that would enhance imperial security for generations. Perhaps most importantly, they demonstrated the deep cultural resources available for recovery and renewal. The shared understanding of cosmic order, royal responsibility, and collective purpose that could mobilize a society to rebuild from catastrophe. As we follow the empire's journey through these challenging years, we see not a simple narrative of decline, but rather a complex interplay of vulnerability and resilience, of setback and recovery. The Khmer civilization proved capable of absorbing significant trauma and emerging with new forms of expression and organization. This capacity for regeneration, this ability to transform crisis into opportunity for renewal, represents one of the most impressive aspects of this remarkable society. In the year 1181 CE, as Jayavarman VII ascended to the Khmer throne, a profound transformation was about to unfold across the empire. Rising from the ashes of invasion and occupation, this remarkable leader would embark on the most ambitious building program in Khmer history, while simultaneously introducing religious and administrative innovations that would reshape the imperial project. Unlike his predecessors who ruled primarily as Hindu Devaraja god-kings, Jayavarman embraced Mahayana Buddhism and presented himself as a bodhisattva king, governing through compassion and committed to alleviating the suffering of all beings. Already in his 60s when he claimed the throne, unusually advanced in age for the period, Jayavarman brought to his rule a mature vision shaped by both personal experience and the collective trauma of the Cham invasion. His early life remains somewhat mysterious, with evidence suggesting he may have spent time in Champa, possibly as a hostage or exile. These experiences, beyond the boundaries of the Khmer world, likely influenced his openness to new ideas and his pragmatic approach to governance. The Buddhist orientation of his reign marked a significant departure from established tradition. While Buddhism had existed within the Khmer Empire previously, imperial patronage had focused primarily on Shaivite or Vaishnavite forms of Hinduism. Jayavarman's personal devotion to Mahayana Buddhism, particularly to the Bodhisattva Avalokiteshvara, embodiment of universal compassion, informed a new conception of kingship centered on the relief of suffering rather than the embodiment of divine power. This shift in religious emphasis did not represent a complete break with Hindu traditions. Rather, it exemplified the syncretic nature of Southeast Asian religious practice, where new elements were incorporated alongside existing beliefs in complex layering rather than outright replacement. Many Hindu deities continued to be venerated during Jayavarman's reign, and he maintained support for Brahmin priests and Hindu foundations established by his predecessors. This religious inclusivity reflected both political pragmatism and the fluid spiritual landscape of the region. The most visible expression of Jayavarman's vision was his creation of a new capital city, Angkor Thom, Great City, encompassing an area of approximately 9 square kilometers. Surrounded by a massive wall and moat, with monumental gateways at the cardinal directions, this urban space represented a cosmological diagram made manifest in earth and stone. The perfect square of the city, with the Bayon Temple precisely at its center, created a mandala-like structure that symbolically ordered the universe around the Buddhist king. The approach to any of Angkor Thom's 5 gates provides one of the most dramatic architectural experiences in world history. A causeway crosses the 100-meter wide moat, lined on each side by a balustrade taking the form of a massive naga, serpent deity. The gateway itself rises 23 meters high, crowned with 4 gigantic stone faces gazing serenely in the cardinal directions. These are believed to represent Avalokiteshvara, bearing a striking resemblance to Jayavarman VII himself, creating a visual association between the compassionate bodhisattva and the king who embodied his qualities in governance. Imagine approaching the south gate of Angkor Thom as a visitor during Jayavarman's reign. As you cross the causeway, you pass between the ranks of devas, gods, and asuras. The massive gateway looms before you, its 4 faces seeming to observe your progress with enigmatic smiles. Passing through the shadowed tunnel of the gateway, you emerge into a different world, a carefully planned urban space where sacred and secular functions intertwine, where the king's Buddhist vision is expressed in architecture and spatial relationships. At the precise center of this cosmic city stood the Bayon, Jayavarman's state temple, and perhaps the most psychologically powerful structure in Khmer architecture. Originally featuring 49 towers, each adorned with 4 faces similar to those on the city gates, the temple created the impression of being observed from every angle by the same benevolent but omniscient presence. Modern visitors often describe a sense of being watched, yet not threatened, an architectural manifestation of compassionate awareness rather than judgmental scrutiny. The Bayon's unique design reflected its hybrid religious function. At ground level, its outer galleries featured extensive bas-reliefs depicting both historical events from Jayavarman's reign and scenes from everyday life in the Khmer Empire. These carvings provide invaluable evidence of 12th century life markets, bustling with trade, naval battles against the Sham, village festivals, cooking scenes, childbirth, and countless other glimpses of ordinary experience. Unlike earlier temples that focused primarily on mythological narratives, the Bayon documented the lived reality of the society it served. Above these galleries of earthly experience, the temple rose in increasingly sacred tiers toward a central sanctuary that originally housed a large Buddha image. The progression from historical narrative to transcendent symbolism created a 3-dimensional expression of Buddhist cosmology, where the mundane world and ultimate reality interpenetrate rather than existing in separate realms. This architectural philosophy reflected Mahayana Buddhist concepts about the non-duality of samsara, the cycle of worldly existence, and nirvana, enlightened awareness. Beyond Angkor, Thom, and the Bayon, Jayavarman's building program extended throughout the empire. Hundreds of construction projects were initiated during his approximately 30-year reign. These included not only temples, but also practical infrastructure that reflected his conception of Buddhist kingship as service to the population. Among the most notable were the 102 hospitals distributed across the kingdom, a network of rest houses along major roads, and numerous bridges capable of withstanding seasonal flooding. This focus on public works represented a distinctive feature of Jayavarman's reign. While earlier kings had invested primarily in temples and hydraulic infrastructure directly supporting agricultural production, Jayavarman expanded the concept of royal responsibility to include more direct forms of welfare provision. Inscriptions from the period emphasize his concern for the suffering of his subjects and his determination to alleviate it through practical interventions. Medical care, shelter for travelers, and improved transportation networks. The Ta Prohm Temple, dedicated in 1186, offers insight into the scale of these religious foundations. According to its inscription, this single establishment employed 12,640 people, including 18 high priests, 2,704 officials, 2,202 assistants, and 613 dancers. It controlled 3,140 villages, used 66,065 men and women as workers, and required 165,404 kilograms of rice per year for sustenance. These statistics suggest the enormous economic impact of Jayavarman's construction program and the significant portion of the empire's productive capacity directed toward religious establishments. The Preah Khan temple complex, completed around 1191, combined religious functions with educational roles, potentially serving as a Buddhist university. Its inscription indicates that 97,840 people served the temple, living in 5,024 villages. The complex included shrines not only to Buddha but also to Vishnu, Shiva, and Jayavarman's parents, demonstrating the religious syncretism that persisted despite the king's personal Buddhist orientation. This massive establishment housed sacred objects including a Buddha relic, and facilitated both worship and learning within its extensive precincts. Imagine the activity surrounding these major foundations during their prime. Monks in saffron robes move through shaded cloisters, some engaged in meditation, others instructing novices in sacred texts. Pilgrims arrive from distant provinces, bringing offerings and seeking blessings. Administrators manage the extensive landholdings that support the institution, while craftspeople maintain the physical structure and create objects needed for ritual purposes. Dancers and musicians prepare for ceremonies that will honor both the Buddha and other deities housed within the complex. The sound of chanting, the fragrance of incense, and the choreographed movement of ritual participants create a multi-sensory sacred environment. The logistical demands of Jayavarman's construction program were staggering. Tens of thousands of workers were mobilized simultaneously across multiple sites. Stone was quarried from the Kulen Hills, transported across considerable distances, and carved according to complex iconographic programs. Specialized craftspeople, architects, sculptors, woodcarvers, metalsmiths were required in numbers that stretched the capacity of available skilled labor. The administrative coordination necessary for these projects suggests a highly developed bureaucracy capable of allocating resources and managing workflows across the empire. This unprecedented scale of construction, while creating monuments of enduring beauty and spiritual power, may have placed unsustainable burdens on the Khmer population and economy. Some historians suggest that the intensive demands of Jayavarman's building program contributed to long-term systemic stresses that would manifest in later periods. The diversion of labor from agricultural production, the resources consumed by religious establishments, and the ongoing maintenance requirements of these extensive monuments represented significant economic commitments that continued long after their initial construction. Militarily, Jayavarman's reign began with campaigns to expel Cham forces from Khmer territory and eventually extended to counter-invasion of Champa itself. By approximately 1190, he had succeeded in making Champa a vassal state, dramatically reversing the power dynamic that had led to Angkor's occupation less than 2 decades earlier. His armies also campaigned against Dai Viet, northern Vietnam, and extended Khmer influence westward into territories of present-day Thailand. These military successes restored and even expanded the territorial reach of the empire, creating the largest extent of direct Khmer control in history. The bas-reliefs of the Bayon provide visual documentation of these military campaigns, showing Khmer forces in both land and naval engagements. These carvings reveal details of military technology and tactics, soldiers wearing distinctive armor and carrying various weapons, war elephants equipped for battle, and naval vessels with multiple oarsmen and armed combatants. The prominence of these military scenes alongside religious imagery and depictions of everyday life suggests the importance of martial success in Jayavarman's conception of righteous Buddhist kingship. Protection of the Dharma required not only compassion but also strength. Administrative innovations accompanied the military and construction achievements of the reign. Jayavarman appears to have implemented more direct governance structures, reducing the autonomy of regional elites and creating stronger connections between the imperial center and provincial territories. The network of roads, rest houses, and hospitals facilitated both administrative communication and military movement, enhancing the practical integration of the empire. Standardized Buddha images distributed throughout the kingdom created visual consistency in religious practice across diverse regions. As Jayavarman aged, the pace of construction gradually slowed, though projects initiated earlier continued toward completion. The exact date of his death remains uncertain, with estimates ranging from 1215 to 1220 CE. What followed was not immediate decline, but rather a period of consolidation under his successors, who faced the challenge of maintaining the expanded infrastructure and religious establishments while balancing the economic demands. The legacy of Jayavarman VII extends far beyond the physical monuments he created. His reign represented a reimagining of the relationship between ruler and ruled, emphasizing welfare provision alongside traditional concepts of divine kingship. His embrace of Mahayana Buddhism created space for new religious developments that would eventually transform Khmer society. His extensive documentation of everyday life in temple reliefs preserved invaluable evidence of 12th century Southeast Asian society that might otherwise have been lost to history. As evening settles over the face towers of the Bayon, their enigmatic expressions seemingly shift with the changing light. These stone visages, possibly representing Avalokiteshvara, possibly Jayavarman himself, likely an intentional conflation of the two, continue to watch over the landscape as they have for more than 8 centuries. In their serene gaze, we can still sense something of the vision that animated the Buddhist king, a commitment to compassionate governance, a determination to create sacred space that elevates ordinary experience, an ambition to manifest enlightened awareness in stone and society alike. The twilight of Jayavarman's reign marked not an ending but a transition, a passage from one conception of imperial power to another, from the immediate trauma of invasion to a restored cosmic order, from primarily Hindu expressions of divine kingship to more explicitly Buddhist formulations of royal responsibility. The empire he renewed would continue for centuries more, though never again with quite the same building ambition or expansive territorial control. His vision of a Buddhist imperial order, however, would have lasting effects on the religious landscape of Southeast Asia, influencing developments far beyond the boundaries of the Khmer world. In the centuries following Jayavarman VII's reign, a profound religious transformation gradually reshaped the spiritual landscape of the Khmer Empire. This was not a sudden revolution, but rather a slow evolution, as Theravada Buddhism progressively displaced both the Mahayana Buddhism favored by Jayavarman VII and the Hindu traditions that had dominated earlier periods. This religious shift would have far-reaching consequences, affecting not only religious practice, but also social organization, political structures, and the very conception of kingship that had sustained the empire for centuries. The 13th century witnessed the initial stages of this transformation. Under Jayavarman VII's immediate successors, the Mahayana Buddhist institutions he had established continued to receive royal patronage, coexisting with the Hindu establishments of earlier reigns. The syncretism that had long characterized Khmer religious life, with elements of various traditions blending in complex ways rather than existing as rigid, separate systems. However, subtle changes were already unfolding. Theravada Buddhism, which emphasized the historical Buddha's teachings preserved in the Pali Canon and stressed individual spiritual effort toward liberation, had long been present in Southeast Asia, particularly in areas influenced by Mon culture to the west of the Khmer Heartland. This tradition gained increasing influence among the Khmer, possibly through contact with Sri Lanka, where Theravada was experiencing a revival during this period. Unlike the court-centered religious practices of state Hinduism or the elaborate Mahayana Buddhist establishments patronized by Jayavarman VII, Theravada Buddhism offered a more decentralized approach to spiritual life. Its emphasis on the Sangha monastic community as the primary religious institution created centers of spiritual authority, partially independent from royal power. This tradition's focus on individual ethical conduct and spiritual development, accessible to all regardless of social position, held particular appeal for ordinary people seeking meaningful religious practice in their daily lives. Imagine a village in the Khmer countryside during this transitional period. A simple wooden sala pavilion has been constructed near the settlement, where a small group of monks in saffron robes has taken up residence. Each morning, they walk silently through the village with their alms bowls, receiving food offerings from households. In return, they offer blessings and occasional teachings, explaining the Buddha's Dharma in the local language rather than Sanskrit. On observance days marking the lunar cycle, villagers gather at the sala to hear sutras recited, make offerings, and undertake special religious practices. This direct relationship between monastic community and lay supporters represents a significant shift from the more hierarchical, priest-mediated religious practices of earlier periods. The adoption of Theravada Buddhism occurred first among ordinary Khmer people, before gradually influencing the elite and eventually the royal court itself. This bottom-up pattern of religious change contrasted with earlier spiritual shifts that had typically been initiated through royal patronage and then disseminated downward through society. By the late 13th century, evidence suggests that Theravada Buddhism was gaining significant popular following, creating a new religious landscape alongside existing traditions. This religious evolution coincided with, and was likely influenced by, changing regional dynamics. The Thai peoples who were establishing principalities in territories previously under Khmer influence had themselves largely adopted Theravada Buddhism. As these polities grew in power and cultural significance, their religious orientation affected neighboring societies, including the Khmer. Commercial and diplomatic contacts with these emerging Thai states facilitated the flow of religious ideas, texts, and practitioners throughout the region. The reign of Indravarman III, 1295 to 1308, marks an important moment in this religious transition. While continuing to support traditional Hindu foundations, this ruler also patronized Theravada Buddhism, notably ordering the installation of a standing Buddha image in the Bayon, the great temple at the center of Angkor Thom. that had previously housed a different form of Buddha associated with Mahayana practices. This act symbolized the growing acceptance of Theravada at the highest levels of Khmer society. The physical transformation of temples during this period provides visible evidence of changing religious practices. Hindu temples, designed with small inner sanctuaries accessible only to priests, were gradually modified to accommodate the more communal worship style of Theravada Buddhism. Walls were sometimes removed to create larger assembly spaces where monks could preach to gathered laity. Buddha images in the distinctive Theravada style, depicting the historical Buddha rather than cosmic bodhisattvas, began to appear in previously Hindu sacred spaces. At Angkor Wat itself, originally dedicated to Vishnu, modifications were made to adapt sections of the vast complex for Buddhist use. The bas-reliefs depicting Hindu mythology remained unchanged, but new Buddha images were installed, and spaces were reconfigured for different ritual purposes. This adaptation, rather than destruction of earlier religious art, reflected the characteristically Southeast Asian approach to religious change, incorporation and reinterpretation rather than iconoclastic replacement. The progressive adoption of Theravada Buddhism brought significant changes to Khmer conceptions of kingship and political legitimacy. The traditional model of the Devaraja, god-king, that had underpinned Khmer imperial authority for centuries was increasingly supplanted by the concept of the Dhamaraja, righteous king, who ruled according to Buddhist principles. This shift did not eliminate the sacred character of monarchy, but reoriented it from divine embodiment toward ethical exemplification. The king as supporter of the Dharma, rather than manifestation of divine power. This changing concept of kingship had practical implications for governance. Where earlier rulers had demonstrated their legitimacy, primarily through massive temple construction projects that emphasized their connection to the divine realm, Theravada Buddhist kingship placed greater emphasis on ethical conduct, support for the Sangha, and acts of merit-making accessible to all. The monumental building programs that had characterized earlier reigns and consumed enormous resources gradually gave way to smaller-scale religious foundations focused on supporting monastic communities. By the early 14th century, the religious landscape of the Khmer Empire had been substantially transformed. Theravada Buddhism had become the predominant faith, though elements of earlier traditions persisted in complex syncretism. Hindu priests continued to perform rituals at court, particularly those associated with coronation and other state ceremonies. Local spirit beliefs and practices remained vital components of everyday religious life. Yet the primary institutional expression of religion had shifted decisively toward Theravada Buddhist monasticism. This religious transformation affected social organization in profound ways. The Theravada monastery, Wat, emerged as a central institution in both urban and rural communities, serving multiple functions beyond purely religious roles. Monasteries became centers of education, with young men typically spending at least some period of their lives as monks or novices, learning not only religious texts, but also literacy and other practical knowledge. They served as social welfare providers, offering support to the elderly, orphans, and others in need. They functioned as community gathering places where both sacred and secular activities could unfold. Imagine the scene at a Wat during an important Buddhist festival in this period. The monastery grounds are filled with people from surrounding villages who have brought offerings of food, flowers, and practical items for the monks. Colorful cloth banners hang from trees and buildings. The air is filled with the sound of chanting, the fragrance of incense, and the occasional ringing of bells. Elders sit in shaded areas discussing community matters, while children play in open spaces. Monks move through the gathering, offering blessings and teachings. This integration of religious observance with community life characterized the new Buddhist social order. For women, the religious transition brought both continuities and changes. While full ordination as bhikkhunis, nuns, appears to have been limited, women could take on roles as meichi, lay practitioners who followed certain precepts and often lived in or near monasteries. More importantly, Theravada Buddhism offered women direct paths to merit-making through support of the Sangha, rather than accessing spiritual benefits primarily through male intermediaries, as in some earlier practices. Women became important patrons of religious institutions, commissioning Buddha images and supporting monastery construction. The transmission of religious knowledge underwent significant changes during this transition. Where earlier traditions had relied heavily on Sanskrit texts interpreted by specialized priestly lineages, Theravada Buddhism emphasized texts in Pali that could be translated and explained in local languages. This more accessible approach to spiritual teaching, combined with the educational function of monasteries, gradually increased religious literacy throughout society. The Jataka tales, stories of the Buddha's previous lives that conveyed ethical lessons through engaging narratives, became particularly popular, influencing literature, visual arts, and performance traditions. The visual culture of the Khmer Empire evolved to reflect these religious changes. The earlier emphasis on complex iconographic programs depicting multiple deities with their attributes gave way to more standardized representations of the historical Buddha in various mudras, symbolic gestures. Standing and seated Buddha images in the distinctive Sukhothai style, showing influence from emerging Thai artistic traditions, began to appear throughout Khmer territories. These images emphasized the Buddha's human qualities and historical reality, rather than cosmic or metaphysical aspects that had dominated earlier religious art. The practice of covering earlier Hindu imagery with stucco to transform it into Buddhist iconography became common during this period. This pragmatic approach allowed repurposing of existing sacred spaces without the need for complete reconstruction. Over time, much of this stucco has fallen away, revealing the original Hindu sculptures beneath, and providing modern scholars with visual evidence of this religious transformation. The layering of religious expressions in single objects or spaces perfectly captures the gradual, non-confrontational nature of this spiritual evolution. By the mid-14th century, the religious transformation was largely complete. Theravada Buddhism had become the predominant tradition throughout the Khmer Empire, creating new patterns of institutional authority, ritual practice, and popular belief that would characterize Cambodian society for centuries to come. Yet this was not a simple replacement of one system with another, but rather a complex integration that preserved elements of earlier traditions within a new synthesis. As twilight gathers over Angkor, with the last rays of sunlight illuminating the face of a serene Buddha image installed within a former Hindu shrine, one can sense how this religious evolution reflected deeper changes in Khmer society and governance. The shift toward more decentralized religious authority, with networks of monasteries spread throughout the kingdom, paralleled broader trends toward more distributed political power that would characterize the later imperial period. The changing conception of kingship, from divine embodiment to ethical exemplar, reflected evolving understandings of political legitimacy and royal responsibility. In this gradual transformation of faith, we find neither violent iconoclasm nor rigid sectarianism, but rather the characteristic Southeast Asian pattern of inclusive spiritual evolution. The changing face of faith in the Khmer Empire demonstrates how religious transitions can unfold organically through cultural exchange, popular adoption, and eventual elite acceptance. Creating new spiritual landscapes that honor ancestral traditions while opening paths to different understandings of the sacred and its relationship to everyday life. As the 13th century progressed into the 14th, beneath the surface of continuing religious and cultural development, subtle yet significant environmental pressures began to accumulate across the Khmer Empire. These were not sudden catastrophes, but rather gradual processes. The slow exhaustion of soils, the progressive silting of waterways, the cumulative impact of deforestation, and the subtle shifts in rainfall patterns that together would create mounting challenges for the sophisticated but vulnerable hydraulic civilization centered at Angkor. The Khmer Empire's remarkable prosperity had always been built upon its mastery of water. The vast irrigation networks, reservoirs, and canal systems that characterized the Angkorian landscape had transformed seasonal abundance into year-round agricultural productivity. This hydraulic infrastructure represented generations of investment and engineering knowledge, allowing the region to support population densities far beyond what would have been possible with rainfall agriculture alone. Yet this very success contained the seeds of potential vulnerability. One of the most significant environmental challenges faced by the late Angkorian society was the gradual degradation of this water management system. The massive barrages, reservoirs, and their associated distribution channels required constant maintenance to function effectively. Sediment carried by inflowing water would gradually accumulate, reducing storage capacity and altering flow patterns. Vegetation growth in canals could impede water movement if not regularly cleared. Embankments needed periodic reinforcement to prevent erosion during heavy monsoon flows. Recent archaeological research using advanced remote sensing technologies has revealed evidence of repeated attempts to address these issues. Sections of canals show signs of having been re-excavated, sometimes with altered courses suggesting adaptation to changing conditions. Some distribution channels appear to have been abandoned and replaced with new constructions. These modifications indicate that Angkorian engineers were actively responding to maintenance challenges, yet the scale of the system made comprehensive upkeep increasingly difficult. Imagine standing beside one of the smaller distribution canals during the late monsoon season, where once water had flowed freely, delivering life-giving moisture to rice fields. Now the channel is partially obstructed with silt and aquatic vegetation. Workers with simple tools, wooden shovels, woven baskets, bare hands, labor to clear the blockages before the dry season arrives. Their efforts will restore flow temporarily, but the process must be repeated season after season, year after year, across thousands of kilometers of waterways. This constant battle against entropy required enormous human labor and careful coordination, both of which may have become increasingly scarce resources as other stresses accumulated within the imperial system. Deforestation represents another significant environmental factor affecting the late Angkorian landscape. The construction of temples, palaces, and urban infrastructure required vast quantities of timber, not only for buildings themselves, but also for scaffolding, transportation equipment, and fuel for firing bricks and cooking lime mortar. Additionally, the expanding population needed wood for housing, boat building, tool making, and daily cooking fires. This steady demand for forest products gradually transformed the landscape surrounding the imperial center. The environmental consequences of deforestation extended beyond the simple loss of trees. Forest clearing altered watershed dynamics, potentially increasing erosion during heavy rains and reducing the ability of the landscape to retain moisture during dry periods. Soil washed from deforested uplands would eventually make its way into the hydraulic system, contributing to the sedimentation issues previously described. The loss of forest cover may have created microclimatic changes, affecting local temperature and rainfall patterns in ways subtle but significant for agricultural productivity. The soundscape of these environmental changes would have unfolded so gradually as to be almost imperceptible within a single human lifetime. The distant rhythm of axe strokes moving ever further from settlements as nearby timber resources were exhausted. The subtle shift in the sound of rainfall on increasingly bare hillsides, water moving more rapidly across exposed soil rather than being caught and slowed by forest vegetation. The altered acoustics of landscapes once dampened by tree cover, now more open and reverberant. These auditory changes, like the visual transformation from forest to field to scrubland, accumulated across generations rather than erupting as sudden crisis. Climate fluctuations beyond local human influence added another layer of environmental challenge. Evidence suggests that the 14th and 15th centuries brought significant climate anomalies to Southeast Asia, including periods of unusually severe drought alternating with years of excessive rainfall. These fluctuations coincided with the onset of what climatologists call the Little Ice Age, a period of global cooling that affected weather patterns worldwide beginning around 1300 CE. For a hydraulic civilization designed around managing the predictable seasonal rhythm of monsoon and dry period, these climatic irregularities would have created serious difficulties. Infrastructure engineered to handle typical water volumes might prove inadequate during extreme rainfall events, potentially leading to dam breaches or canal overflow. Conversely, extended droughts would reduce the system's ability to store sufficient water for dry season irrigation, potentially leading to crop failures or reduced harvests. Sediment cores from regional lakes and dendrochronological studies Historical accounts from neighboring regions corroborate these findings, describing crop failures and water shortages during the same timeframe. While the Khmer Empire had weathered climate variations throughout its history, these particular fluctuations arrived at a time when other stresses, administrative, economic, religious, and geopolitical, were already creating systemic challenges. The cumulative effect of environmental pressures on agricultural productivity would have created ripple effects throughout the imperial system. Rice surpluses had long formed the material foundation for all other aspects of Khmer civilization: the labor for temple construction, the maintenance of military forces, the support of religious establishments, the luxuries of court life. Any reduction in this agricultural foundation would necessarily constrain activities in these dependent sectors. Evidence from archaeological investigations suggests that rice production in the Angkorian Heartland did indeed decline during the late period. Analysis of soil samples shows decreased evidence of intensive cultivation in areas that had previously been highly productive. Settlement patterns shifted, with some formerly populous areas showing signs of reduced habitation or abandonment. These changes were not uniform across the landscape, but varied according to local conditions, creating a patchwork of decline rather than wholesale collapse. For communities experiencing these environmental challenges, adaptation rather than abandonment would typically be the first response. Farmers might adjust planting schedules to accommodate changing rainfall patterns, switch to crop varieties better suited to altered conditions, or modify field systems to improve water efficiency. Archaeological evidence suggests such adaptations did occur, with some areas showing evidence of more diverse cropping strategies and modified field layouts during the late period. Imagine a family of farmers discussing their planting strategy as they observe the sky during what should be the beginning of the monsoon season. The rains that once arrived with reliable timing now seem delayed, creating uncertainty about when to prepare fields and sow rice. The grandmother recalls how her parents taught her to read subtle environmental signs, certain flowering plants, insect behaviors, cloud patterns. Now these indicators seem less trustworthy. The family decides to divide their risk by planting several smaller fields at different times rather than committing all their seed rice at once, a reasonable adaptation to increased climatic variability. The relationship between environmental challenges and administrative capacity created a potentially dangerous feedback loop. Environmental stresses reduced agricultural surplus, potentially limiting resources available for maintenance of hydraulic infrastructure. This deterioration of infrastructure further reduced agricultural productivity, creating additional resource constraints. Meanwhile, the need for labor to maintain increasingly problematic water systems competed with other imperial priorities: religious construction, military service, elite consumption, creating difficult allocation decisions for administrative authorities. Recent archaeological research has revealed evidence of large-scale water management modifications during the late Angkorian period that appear to represent attempts to address these mounting challenges. Radar imagery shows extensive new canal construction to the north of the urban core, possibly designed to divert excess water during heavy rainfall events. Other hydraulic features suggest efforts to reconfigure the system for changing conditions. These substantial engineering projects indicate that imperial authorities recognized the environmental challenges and mobilized significant resources to address them. These adaptations demonstrate the resilience and technical sophistication that characterized Khmer civilization even during a period of accumulating stress. Rather than passive victims of environmental change, the people and leadership of the late empire actively responded to emerging challenges, modifying systems and practices to accommodate new conditions. That these efforts ultimately proved insufficient to prevent significant transformation of the imperial system reflects not lack of awareness or capability, but rather the complex interaction of environmental pressures with other concurrent challenges. The environmental strains affecting the Khmer Empire did not constitute a simple, linear cause of imperial transformation. Rather, they formed one important strand in a complex web of interacting factors that collectively created the conditions for significant socio-political change. Religious shifts, external political pressures, economic reorientations, and administrative evolution all occurred simultaneously with environmental challenges, each influencing and being influenced by the others in complex feedback loops. What makes the environmental dimension particularly significant is its impact on the material foundation of the entire imperial system. The sophisticated hydraulic infrastructure that had transformed seasonal water abundance into year-round agricultural productivity represented both the Khmer Empire's greatest achievement and potentially its greatest vulnerability. When this system began to experience strain, whether from climatic fluctuations, maintenance challenges, or changed watershed dynamics, the repercussions extended throughout the society it supported. As evening settles over the Angkorian landscape, imagine standing on the embankment of the Western Beret, that massive hydraulic achievement of imperial engineering. In the fading light, fishing boats return with their day's catch, their movements creating ripples across water that reflects the darkening sky. The reservoir still functions, still supports life, still connects communities to the rhythms of water that have sustained this civilization for centuries. Yet subtle signs of strain are visible if one knows where to look. sections where the embankment has required reinforcement, areas where water plants indicate increasing sedimentation, channels where flow has diminished from original design capacity. These quiet indicators of environmental stress, accumulating gradually across decades and centuries, would contribute significantly to the transformations awaiting the Khmer Empire. Not through sudden catastrophe, but through the slow, persistent pressure of changing conditions against which even the most sophisticated pre-industrial society had limited capacity to respond. The story of these environmental challenges reminds us that civilizations exist not as abstract political or cultural systems, but as material relationships between human communities and the landscapes they inhabit. Relationships that must constantly adapt to maintain balance in a world of perpetual change. As the 14th century unfolded across mainland Southeast Asia, a significant geopolitical transformation was reshaping the balance of power that had long positioned the Khmer Empire at its center. To the west, in the fertile valley of the Chao Phraya River, a new kingdom was coalescing that would eventually challenge Angkorian dominance and help reorient the political and commercial landscape of the entire region. This was Ayutthaya, named for its capital city established on an island at the confluence of 3 rivers. A strategic location that combined defensive advantages with excellent access to regional trade networks. The emergence of Ayutthaya was part of a broader process of Thai political consolidation that had been underway for generations. Thai peoples had been migrating southward from southwestern China since at least the 10th century, gradually establishing principalities throughout territories that had previously been dominated by Mon and Khmer polities. By the early 14th century, several significant Thai states had formed, including Sukhothai, Lana, and numerous smaller entities that maintained complex relationships of alliance, vassalage, and occasional conflict with one another. In 1351, according to traditional historiography, King Yu Thong established Ayutthaya as a new capital, strategically positioned to control both riverine trade and access to the Gulf of Siam. The city's island location, surrounded by rivers that could be diverted for defense, provided natural protection against invasion. Its position at the intersection of overland and maritime trade routes offered commercial advantages that would contribute significantly to its rapid rise as a regional power. The founding of Ayutthaya did not immediately threaten Khmer hegemony. Indeed, early Ayutthayan culture showed strong Khmer influence, adopting elements of administrative practice, religious traditions, court ceremonies, and artistic styles from the still prestigious Angkorian civilization. Khmer remained an important ceremonial language used in court documents and religious contexts alongside Thai. Even the architecture of early Ayutthayan temples echoed Khmer models, though gradually evolving toward more distinctive styles. Imagine the scene at the nascent Ayutthayan court during these formative decades. A Thai ruler might be surrounded by advisors and officials wearing garments influenced by Khmer court dress, conducting ceremonies that blend Thai traditions with elements borrowed from Angkor. Documents might be prepared by scribes trained in both Thai and Khmer writing systems. Envoys might arrive from neighboring polities, including the Khmer Empire itself, establishing diplomatic relationships that acknowledged the emerging power while still respecting established hierarchies. This cultural borrowing reflected not subjugation, but rather the prestige still associated with Angkorian civilization. Yet beneath these apparent continuities, fundamental differences were developing that would ultimately position Ayutthaya as a distinct and eventually dominant regional power. Where Angkor had built its economy primarily around intensive rice agriculture supported by massive hydraulic infrastructure, Ayutthaya, from its inception, emphasized maritime trade alongside agricultural production. Its strategic location allowed it to function as an entrepot connecting the inland production zones of the Chao Phraya Basin with international trading networks extending to China, India, and beyond. The soundscape of this emerging commercial center would have contrasted noticeably with the more agrarian ambience of the Khmer Heartland. The calls of merchants announcing their wares in multiple languages, the creaking of wooden ships being loaded and unloaded at riverside docks, the clink of coins and the murmur of price negotiations, the rhythmic chanting of dock workers coordinating their efforts. Ayutthaya's political structure also developed along different lines from the Khmer model. While both systems featured divine kingship, Ayutthayan governance evolved a more flexible administrative approach that incorporated new territories through varying levels of vassalage rather than direct control. This system, known as Mandala politics, allowed for more adaptive relationships with subordinate areas, requiring tribute and loyalty but permitting significant local autonomy. This approach proved particularly effective for managing the diverse and geographically dispersed territories that Ayutthaya would gradually bring under its influence. Religious dynamics further distinguished the emerging Thai polity from its Khmer predecessor. While Angkor had evolved from Hindu foundations toward Theravada Buddhism over many centuries, Ayutthaya was established during a period when Theravada Buddhism was already becoming the dominant tradition throughout the region. The Thai rulers positioned themselves as Dharmarajas, righteous kings, from the outset, actively supporting the Buddhist Sangha monastic community and incorporating Buddhist concepts of merit and kingly virtue into their political legitimation. This religious orientation created natural connections with other Theravada Buddhist polities, particularly Lanka, Sri Lanka, which was experiencing a revival of Buddhist practice and scholarship during this period. Thai chronicles record diplomatic missions and religious exchanges with Lanka, including the transfer of relics and sacred texts. These connections helped establish Ayutthaya within a broader Buddhist ecumene that extended beyond Southeast Asia, providing additional sources of legitimacy and cultural resources. The material culture of early Ayutthaya reflected its hybrid origins and commercial orientation. Excavations have revealed Chinese porcelains alongside locally produced ceramics, Indian textiles with Thai merchant marks, and coinage designed for trade with multiple partners. The architectural remains show initial Khmer influence, gradually giving way to more distinctively Thai styles, with increasing emphasis on tall, graceful prangs, towers, and richly decorated wooden structures that contrasted with the massive stone construction favored at Angkor. By approximately 1370 to 1380, Ayutthaya had consolidated sufficient power to begin directly challenging Khmer dominance in contested border regions. Under King Boromiracha IR 1370–530–88, and especially his son Ramasuan 1388–1395, Ayutthayan forces launched campaigns against territories that had traditionally been under Angkorian control. These military expeditions targeted not only boundary areas, but eventually the Khmer Heartland itself, culminating in attacks on Angkor that traditional histories claim resulted in temporary occupation of the capital. While historical sources for this period require careful interpretation, with both Thai and Khmer accounts prone to exaggeration for political purposes, archaeological evidence does confirm significant military activity and changing control of key sites during the late 14th century. The balance of power was clearly shifting, with Ayutthaya increasingly able to project force into formerly secure Khmer territories, while the Angkorian state struggled to maintain its traditional boundaries. These military encounters would have brought profound disruption to affected communities. Imagine a village near the contested borderlands. As word arrives of approaching forces, families quickly gather essential possessions: cooking vessels, agricultural tools, religious objects, seed rice for the next planting, and move toward forest areas where they might find temporary safety. Those unable to flee, the elderly, the very young, the ill, must hope for restraint from whichever army arrives. When the immediate danger passes, survivors return to assess damages, rebuild what has been destroyed, and adapt to whatever new political reality has been imposed by the conflict. Beyond direct military confrontation, Ayutthaya's rise created other forms of pressure on the Khmer Empire. Commercial routes began to reorient toward the emerging Thai center and its access to maritime networks. Chinese and other foreign merchants increasingly directed their activities toward Ayutthayan ports rather than the more inland Khmer territories. Tributary relationships with smaller polities that had once acknowledged Angkorian suzerainty gradually shifted toward the ascending power. These changes eroded the economic foundations and diplomatic prestige that had sustained Khmer imperial power for centuries. The rise of Ayutthaya coincided with similar power transitions elsewhere in Southeast Asia. To the east, Dai Viet, northern Vietnam, was asserting greater independence and expansionist ambitions. To the west, various Mon and Burman states were engaged in their own complex power struggles. These concurrent developments created a fluid geopolitical environment where traditional certainties were increasingly challenged and new possibilities emerged for political realignment. It is important to recognize that these changing power dynamics did not unfold as simple binary competition between monolithic states. Both the Khmer Empire and Ayutthaya contained internal factions with different interests and perspectives. Border communities often maintained connections and identities that crossed political boundaries. Religious networks, particularly Buddhist monastic lineages, created transnational relationships that sometimes operated independently of state politics. Commercial interests might maintain productive exchanges, even during periods of political tension. By the early 15th century, the ascendancy of Ayutthaya as the predominant power in central mainland Southeast Asia had become increasingly clear. Under King Intharacha, R. 1409-1424, and his successors, the Thai kingdom continued to expand its influence, consolidate its administrative systems, and develop distinctive cultural forms that synthesized earlier borrowings into new expressions. Its capital city grew into one of the region's most significant urban centers, described with admiration by European visitors who would eventually reach the kingdom in the 16th century. For the Khmer Empire, the emergence of this new regional power necessitated significant adaptation. The traditional conception of Chakravartin kingship, the universal monarch at the center of a mandala of power, became increasingly difficult to maintain as Ayutthaya presented an alternative center with growing prestige and influence. The practical challenges of defending extensive territories against an energetic and expanding neighbor strained military resources already under pressure from other demands. The gradual reorientation of trade networks reduced access to luxury goods and limited opportunities for revenue collection from commercial activities. In response to these pressures, the late Angkorian state appears to have pursued several adaptive strategies. Diplomatic efforts attempted to maintain peaceful relations where possible, sometimes acknowledging the changing balance of power through ceremonial gestures or strategic marriages. Military resources were concentrated on defending core territories rather than maintaining the full extent of earlier imperial claims. Internal administration evolved toward more localized authority, perhaps reflecting both practical necessities and the influence of Theravada Buddhist conceptions of governance. As twilight descends over the region in this period of transition, we might imagine two rulers, one at Angkor, one at Ayutthaya, contemplating the changing landscape of power from their respective vantage points. The Khmer king gazes westward from a palace that still echoes the grandeur of past centuries, but increasingly shows signs of adaptation to new realities. The Thai king looks southward toward the sea that connects his realm to wider networks of trade and influence, while still acknowledging the cultural debt his young kingdom owes to its more ancient neighbor. Between them lies a contested landscape where communities navigate shifting allegiances, where centuries-old patterns of life are gradually being reconfigured by new political, economic, and religious currents. This emergence of Ayutthaya as a significant regional power does not represent a simple story of decline and replacement, but rather a complex reconfiguration of Southeast Asian geopolitics with multiple contributing factors and diverse local manifestations. The Khmer Empire would continue as a meaningful political entity, though increasingly transformed from its earlier imperial form. Khmer culture would maintain its distinct identity and continue to influence its neighbors even as political fortunes shifted. The lasting significance of Ayutthaya's rise lies not in any simplistic victory over Angkor, but in its role catalyzing broader regional transformations that would reshape mainland Southeast Asia for centuries to come. As the 14th century progressed into the early 15th, the Khmer Empire entered what historians now recognize as a period of significant transformation rather than sudden collapse. One of the most telling indicators of this change was the gradual shift in royal attention away from Angkor toward locations closer to the Mekong River and Tonle Sap Lake's southern reaches. This was not an abrupt abandonment, but rather a series of relocations, returns, and reorientations that collectively signaled a fundamental reconfiguration of the kingdom's political geography. The traditional narrative of Angkor's fall, based primarily on Thai chronicles, described a dramatic conquest by Ayutthayan forces in 1431, followed by complete abandonment of the city. Modern archaeological evidence has substantially revised this understanding, revealing a more nuanced process of gradual transition that had begun decades earlier and would continue for years afterward. Angkor was never entirely deserted. Religious activity continued at many temples, and some population remained, but its central role in Khmer political life was increasingly diminished. Evidence for this shifting focus appears in both the archaeological record and historical documents. Inscriptions from the late 14th century onward show increasing royal activity in regions south and east of the traditional Angkorian heartland. Chinese diplomatic records from the Ming dynasty note changes in the location of the Khmer court, sometimes referring to multiple capitals or describing the king as residing in different locations at different times. Material culture from this period shows new patterns of distribution, with declining density around Angkor and increasing concentration along the Mekong and around the southern shores of Tonle Sap. The first significant shift appears to have occurred under King Ponhea Yat, who reigned in the early 15th century. According to Khmer chronicles, after a period of conflict with Ayutthaya, he relocated his court first to Srey Santhor along the Mekong River and eventually to Chaktomuk near modern Phnom Penh at the confluence of the Mekong, Basak, and Tonle Sap rivers. This location offered several advantages over Angkor: better access to international trade routes, greater distance from the expanding Thai kingdoms to the west, and positioning within more productive agricultural regions less affected by the environmental challenges facing the Angkorian heartland. Imagine the royal progress as the court relocates from Angkor to its new center. A procession stretches along the road, connecting the old capital to riverine transportation routes. Carts carry the sacred regalia of kingship: golden parasols, ceremonial weapons, royal insignia. Brahmin priests accompany Buddha images and sacred texts. Court officials oversee the movement of administrative records and valuable possessions. Guards protect the royal family and high-ranking nobility. This would not be a desperate flight, but a carefully planned transition, maintaining the ceremonial dignity essential to Khmer concepts of kingship, while pragmatically responding to changing circumstances. For those remaining at Angkor, this shift in royal presence would have created significant adjustments. Communities that had been oriented towards servicing the court and administrative center needed to develop new economic foundations or consider relocation themselves. Religious establishments previously supported by royal patronage had to adapt to reduced resources or develop new support networks. The massive hydraulic infrastructure, already facing maintenance challenges, would have experienced further strain as the administrative capacity to organize large-scale labor projects diminished. Yet Angkor was not simply abandoned to jungle reclamation, as romantic 19th century European accounts would later suggest. Archaeological evidence indicates continued occupation and activity, though at reduced scale and intensity. Some temple complexes maintained their religious function, with Buddhist monks adapting former Hindu spaces for Theravada practice. Agricultural communities persisted in areas where local irrigation systems remained functional. The urban footprint contracted, but did not disappear entirely, with population likely clustering around still viable water sources and functioning temple complexes. The environmental challenges discussed in earlier sections likely contributed significantly to this capital relocation. The massive hydraulic system that had supported Angkorian urbanism and intensive agriculture was showing increasing signs of stress by the late 14th century. Recent archaeological research using advanced remote sensing technologies has revealed evidence of hydraulic failures, breached embankments, silted reservoirs, compromised distribution channels that would have reduced agricultural productivity in the Angkorian heartland. Moving the capital to regions with different agricultural systems and better access to riverine resources represented a logical adaptation to these material conditions. Religious factors also influenced this geographic reorientation. The progressive adoption of Theravada Buddhism throughout the Khmer lands had created new patterns of sacred geography and institutional organization. Unlike the massive state-sponsored temple complexes of the Angkorian period, Theravada practice centered on more modest monasteries, wats distributed throughout the landscape, often associated with local communities rather than concentrated at political centers. This religious shift reduced the ritual necessity of maintaining the court at Angkor, where so much of the built environment reflected earlier religious conceptions. The changing economic geography of the region provided additional motivation for capital relocation. Maritime trade was becoming increasingly important throughout Southeast Asia, with new commercial networks connecting China, the Indian Ocean world, and emerging European interests. The Mekong River provided direct access to these international exchanges, offering opportunities for revenue generation through taxation of trade and participation in commercial activities. Positioning the royal center closer to these economic currents allowed the Khmer monarchy to adapt to regional changes while maintaining its political authority. For ordinary people living through this transition period, The experience would have varied dramatically depending on location and social position. Those in communities directly connected to court functions or dependent on Angkorian administrative systems would have faced significant disruption and required substantial adaptation. Agricultural communities in the Angkorian heartland might have experienced declining productivity from deteriorating irrigation infrastructure, potentially leading to gradual outmigration toward more viable regions. Communities along the Mekong or southern Tonle Sap, by contrast, might have benefited from increased royal attention and commercial activity. Imagine a family living in a village near Angkor during this transition period. Their ancestors had for generations provided specialized services to the royal court, perhaps as musicians, textile workers, or administrative functionaries. As royal presence becomes increasingly intermittent and eventually relocates more permanently, they face difficult decisions. Should they maintain their traditional residence and seek new sources of livelihood? Should they follow the court to its new location, leaving behind ancestral lands but maintaining their specialized role? Should they transform their skills to serve the Buddhist monasteries that continue to function in the area? These individual and family choices, multiplied across thousands of households, collectively constituted the lived experience of this historical transition. The relationship between Angkor and the new centers was not one of complete rupture, but rather ongoing connection and periodic interaction. Evidence suggests that Khmer kings occasionally returned to Angkor for certain ceremonies, maintaining ritual relationships with the sacred geography established by their predecessors. Some royal regalia and sacred objects were likely transferred to new locations, creating symbolic continuity between old and new centers of power. Religious specialists may have moved between locations, bringing knowledge and practices from Angkorian traditions to emerging institutions elsewhere in the kingdom. Chinese records from the Ming dynasty provide interesting glimpses of this transitional period. The Ming-Shi History of Ming describes diplomatic missions between the Ming court and the Khmer kingdom, noting changes in the location of the Khmer capital. A mission in 1371 was sent to Luvik rather than Angkor, suggesting that alternative royal residences were already established by the late 14th century. Later records describe the Khmer capital moving several times in response to political and military pressures. These external perspectives confirm the pattern of mobility and adaptation that characterized Khmer governance during this period. By the mid-15th century, the political center of the Khmer kingdom had decisively shifted to the vicinity of modern Phnom Penh and other locations along the Mekong River system. The monarchy continued, maintaining many traditional aspects of Khmer kingship while adapting to changed circumstances. Buddhist monasteries became increasingly central to both religious life and education, creating networks of institutional authority that complemented royal power. Trade with regional and international partners developed along riverine routes, integrating the kingdom into changing commercial patterns of the early modern period. This geographic reorientation should not be viewed simply as retreat or decline, but rather as strategic adaptation to changed environmental, economic, political, and religious conditions. The Khmer monarchy demonstrated remarkable resilience by transforming its operations while maintaining core elements of cultural identity and political legitimacy. Rather than rigidly adhering to patterns established during the imperial zenith, Khmer leadership showed pragmatic flexibility that allowed the kingdom to continue as a meaningful political entity despite significant regional power shifts. As evening settles over this changing landscape, imagine standing at the confluence of rivers where the new capital is taking shape. Boats arrive from upstream and downstream, carrying goods from various provinces and foreign ports. Construction proceeds on wooden palaces and Buddhist temple complexes, creating a built environment adapted to riverine geography rather than the symbolic cosmic architecture of Angkor. Court ceremonies continue, but with adaptations reflecting both Theravada Buddhist influence and practical circumstances. The rhythm of life is increasingly attuned to river currents and trading seasons rather than the ritual calendar of imperial Angkor. In the distant north, as darkness falls over the temples of Angkor, a different scene unfolds. Buddhist monks perform evening rituals in spaces once dedicated to Hindu deities. Village communities maintain smaller-scale irrigation works that continue to support local agriculture. Occasional pilgrims visit sacred sites, maintaining spiritual connections with places of ancestral significance. The massive stone monuments stand as reminders of past imperial glory, gradually being incorporated into different patterns of meaning and use as the society around them evolves. This twilight period of the Angkorian tradition, neither sudden end nor simple continuation, reminds us that historical transitions rarely conform to neat narratives of rise and fall. Instead, we see complex processes of adaptation, selective preservation, pragmatic innovation, and continuous negotiation between tradition and changing circumstances. The Khmer civilization demonstrated remarkable durability precisely because of this capacity for transformation while maintaining core cultural identity, a pattern that would continue through subsequent centuries of regional change. The culmination of the gradual shift away from Angkor occurred in the early decades of the 15th century, when King Phnom Yat established a more permanent royal centre near present-day Phnom Penh. This move, traditionally dated to around 1432 following Siamese incursions into the Angkorian Heartland, represented not the desperate flight often portrayed in earlier histories, but rather the logical conclusion of trends that had been developing for generations. The selection of this location at the confluence of the Mekong, Basak, and Tonle Sap rivers, a site known as Chaktomuk, or Four Faces, for the meeting of waters, reflected a strategic vision adapted to the changing realities of regional politics, economics, and environmental conditions. According to Khmer chronicles, when Phnom Yat arrived at this location, he observed an auspicious sign, a floating tree trunk in which lived a powerful female spirit. Taking this as divine approval, he ordered the construction of a small hill, Phnom, to house sacred relics, around which the new capital would develop. This foundation narrative, while likely embellished with legendary elements, captures the essential continuity of sacred geography in Khmer political thought. Even as the physical location of power shifted, the conceptual framework connecting political authority to cosmic order remained, now expressed through Buddhist rather than primarily Hindu symbolism. The physical setting of the new capital contrasted sharply with Angkor. Rather than a planned imperial city dominated by massive stone temple mountains and geometric reservoirs, Chaktomuk was oriented toward the natural features of the riverine landscape. The meeting of waters provided natural transportation routes in multiple directions, facilitating both administrative communication and commercial exchange. The annual flood pulse of the Mekong created naturally fertile agricultural zones that did not require the extensive hydraulic engineering of the Angkorian system. The river itself offered defensive advantages, with water barriers that could be more easily maintained than the elaborate walls and moats of the former capital. Imagine the early days of settlement at this new centre. Royal barges are moored along the riverbank near temporary wooden structures housing the court. Craftspeople and labourers construct more permanent buildings, wooden palaces raised on stilts according to traditional Southeast Asian designs. Buddhist temple complexes incorporating elements from Angkorian architectural vocabulary, but adapted to new materials and religious requirements. Merchants from various backgrounds, Khmer, Chinese, Cham, Malay, established trading operations along the waterfront. Their diverse languages creating a polyglot soundscape that reflects the site's commercial potential. The air carries the sense of river mud, fish drying in the sun, cooking fires, and the occasional fragrance of incense from religious ceremonies establishing sacred space in the emerging urban landscape. The administrative organization of the realm also evolved with this geographic shift. The highly centralized system that had characterized imperial Angkor, with its elaborate bureaucracy directly managing extensive territories, gradually gave way to more flexible arrangements combining elements of direct rule in core areas with various tributary and alliance relationships in more distant regions. This adaptation reflected both practical necessities, the difficulty of maintaining centralized control over far-flung territories in a changing geopolitical environment, and conceptual changes associated with Theravada Buddhist concepts of righteous kingship. For the monarchy itself, this period brought both continuity and transformation. Core symbols of Khmer kingship persisted: sacred regalia, ceremonial language, ritual practices, royal titles, maintaining connections to the Angkorian tradition despite geographic relocation. Yet the practical expression of royal power increasingly adapted to changed circumstances. Buddhist concepts of merit and karmically earned authority gradually supplemented or replaced earlier notions of divine embodiment. Royal patronage shifted from massive temple construction towards support for the Buddhist Sangha, monastic community, and merit. The Theravada Buddhist monasteries that became increasingly central to Khmer society during this period served multiple functions beyond purely religious roles. They became centers of education, with young men typically spending at least some period as monks or novices, learning not only religious texts but also literacy and other knowledge. They provided social welfare services, offering support for orphans, the elderly, and others in need. They served as neutral spaces for conflict resolution and community governance. This institutional network created forms of social cohesion and cultural continuity that could persist even during periods of political uncertainty. For communities that had been closely tied to the Angkorian center, the final relocation of royal authority necessitated significant adaptation. Specialized service groups, ritual specialists, artisans, administrative functionaries needed to either relocate to maintain their traditional roles or develop new livelihoods within a changing economic landscape. Some likely followed the court to its new center, bringing skills and knowledge that would influence the development of the new capital. Others remained in the Angkorian region, maintaining smaller-scale continuity of practices and traditions associated with the former imperial center. Agricultural communities in the Angkorian Heartland faced particular challenges as the administrative capacity to maintain the complex hydraulic infrastructure diminished. Some irrigation components, smaller reservoirs, local canals, field systems, could be maintained by village-level organization, allowing continued cultivation at reduced scale and intensity. Other areas likely experienced declining productivity as larger system components failed, potentially leading to gradual outmigration toward regions with more viable agricultural conditions. These processes would have unfolded gradually across generations, rather than as sudden abandonment. The relocation of the capital coincided with, and was partially motivated by, changing regional trade patterns that increasingly emphasized maritime and riverine commerce. The new capital's position gave direct access to the South China Sea via the Mekong Delta, facilitating participation in the growing international trade networks of the 15th century. Chinese, Japanese, and eventually European merchant communities established presences in the region, creating new economic opportunities, but also introducing competition and occasional conflict. The Khmer Kingdom adapted to this changing commercial environment, developing systems for taxing trade, regulating foreign merchant communities, and participating directly in commercial activities. Historical records from neighboring states provide external perspectives on this transitional period. Chinese court records note diplomatic missions to and from the Khmer Kingdom during the 15th century, documenting both the geographic shift of the capital and the continuing international recognition of Khmer political legitimacy. Thai chronicles, while often emphasizing military successes against Khmer territories, nevertheless acknowledge the ongoing significance of the kingdom centered now along the Mekong rather than at Angkor. Portuguese accounts from the early 16th century describe a functioning Khmer state engaged in regional politics and commerce. Archaeological evidence from the early Phnom Penh period remains limited compared to the extensive research conducted at Angkor, partly due to the continued occupation and development of the site as Cambodia's modern capital. However, excavations have revealed evidence of early settlement patterns, trade goods connecting the region to various international networks, and religious architecture reflecting the continuation and evolution of Khmer cultural traditions. Future archaeological work promises to provide additional insights into this important transitional period. For those who remained in the Angkorian region after the final relocation of royal authority, life continued, but within a significantly transformed context. Buddhist monasteries maintained religious activity at many former temple sites, adapting earlier sacred spaces to Theravada practices. Some hydraulic infrastructure continued to function at local scale, supporting smaller agricultural communities. Trade and communication networks likely reoriented toward the new centers of political and economic activity, though pilgrimage and cultural memory would have maintained some connections with the former imperial center. Imagine a monastery established within what had once been an imperial temple complex at Angkor. Wooden structures housing monks and novices have been constructed within stone enclosures originally designed for different religious purposes. Buddha images now occupy spaces once dedicated to Hindu deities. The rhythm of daily life follows Theravada monastic practice, morning alms rounds, scriptural study, meditation, rituals marking the lunar calendar. Local villagers support the monastic community with food offerings and participate in periodic ceremonies, maintaining spiritual connection with spaces that retain sacred significance despite changed religious context. This adaptive reuse of the monumental landscape represents not abandonment, but transformation, a repurposing of architectural heritage within new cultural frameworks. The post-Angkorian Khmer kingdom, centered at Phnom Penh, would face significant challenges in subsequent centuries, including periods of vassalage to more powerful neighbors and internal political fragmentation. Yet through these difficulties, core elements of Khmer cultural identity persisted. The Khmer language, Buddhist religious practices, distinctive artistic traditions, and collective memory of Angkorian achievement. This cultural continuity, despite political transformation, demonstrates the remarkable resilience of Khmer civilization beyond the imperial phase of its history. As Twilight deepens over the confluence of rivers where the new capital has taken root, fishing boats return with their day's catch, their movements silhouetted against the darkening sky. The wooden structures of the royal compound and Buddhist temples are illuminated by oil lamps and torches, their light reflecting on the water. Court musicians perform traditional melodies that connect present experience to ancestral memory. Though the setting has changed dramatically from the stone monumentality of Angkor, these cultural expressions maintain continuity across the geographic transition. Different manifestations of an enduring civilization, adapting to changed circumstances while preserving its essential character. In the distant north, darkness settles over the temples of Angkor. Moonlight illuminates carved stone that once represented the cosmic center of an empire. The massive reservoirs reflect stars that have witnessed centuries of human aspiration and achievement. Though the imperial authority that created these monuments has relocated, the physical remnants remain, not as abandoned ruins, but as powerful repositories of cultural memory and spiritual significance that would continue to influence Khmer identity through centuries of historical change. The final move from Angkor to Phnom Penh represents not an ending, but a transformation, one chapter in the continuing story of a resilient civilization. After the Khmer court completed its transition to new centers along the Mekong River, the vast temple complexes and urban infrastructure of Angkor entered a different phase of existence, neither abandoned and forgotten, as early European accounts would later suggest, nor maintaining their original imperial functions. Instead, these extraordinary monuments entered a period of repose, their relationship with the surrounding landscape and human communities gradually transforming as political circumstances changed and forest vegetation slowly reclaimed portions of the built environment. The romantic image of Angkor, swallowed by jungle, popularized by 19th century European explorers and colonial writers, has proven largely inaccurate. Archaeological evidence reveals continuous human presence in the region, though at reduced density compared to the imperial period. Buddhist monastic communities maintained religious activity at many of the major temple complexes, adapting former Hindu sacred spaces to Theravada practices. Agricultural villages persisted in areas where local irrigation systems could be maintained without the massive administrative coordination of earlier centuries. Pilgrimage and ritual connections between the former imperial center and the continuing Khmer kingdom ensured that Angkor remained within living cultural memory rather than becoming a lost city. Imagine the transformed environment of Angkor a century after the court's relocation. The massive stone monuments remain, their fundamental structures intact, though showing signs of reduced maintenance. Tree growth in gutters causing water damage to some sections, wooden gallery roofs gradually deteriorating, vegetation establishing itself in crevices between stones. Around these enduring structures, the intensively managed landscape of the imperial period has begun a gradual transition. Areas once densely populated have reverted to forest or scrubland. Sections of the hydraulic system continue functioning at local scale, maintained by nearby communities, while others have fallen into disrepair, creating new wetland habitats as water flow patterns change. The sounds of this landscape in transition would differ markedly from the imperial period, where once the daily activities of hundreds of thousands of inhabitants created a constant hum of human presence. Now forest sounds predominate in many areas. Bird calls, insect choruses, the rustle of wind through vegetation, occasional troops of monkeys moving through canopy. Yet these natural acoustics would be punctuated by continuing human activities. The rhythmic chanting from monasteries established within former temples, the voices of farmers working fields in still inhabited areas, perhaps the occasional sounds of construction as wooden structures are built or repaired within stone enclosures. This period witnessed a fascinating process of architectural adaptation, as wooden structures associated with Theravada Buddhist practice were incorporated into the stone monuments originally designed for different religious purposes. Monasteries established within temple enclosures added sleeping quarters for monks, meditation halls, and other facilities needed for their communities. Buddha images were installed in spaces previously dedicated to Hindu deities. These physical modifications reflected the broader religious transformation of Khmer society, with Theravada Buddhism becoming firmly established as the predominant faith, while elements of earlier spiritual traditions persisted in syncretic forms. For the Buddhist monks who inhabited these spaces, the monumental environment of Angkor provided both practical shelter and powerful symbolic resonance. Living amidst structures that embodied the concept of Mount Meru and other cosmic geography created tangible connections between abstract religious concepts and physical experience. The transition from darkness to light when moving from interior chambers to open courtyards could serve as metaphor for spiritual enlightenment. The enduring beauty of the carvings depicting divine beings and religious narratives provided visual texts supporting contemplative practice, even when the specific theological context had changed. Local communities maintained various practical relationships with the monumental landscape. Some temple reservoirs and canals continued to provide water for agriculture and daily use. Stone enclosure walls might serve as cattle barriers, market spaces, or even communal gathering points, their ancient carvings silently witnessing new generations of life. In this evolving relationship between past grandeur and present modesty, Angkor became something more profound than either ruin or relic. It transformed into a living palimpsest, layered with history, belief, adaptation, and resilience. Here, the sleeping giants did not vanish into oblivion. They merely shifted posture, breathing quietly beneath the forest canopy, cradling both memory and continuity in their enduring stone embrace.